So without any further ado, I'm going to make my introduction short. But Laura Walls is currently at Notre Dame, of course, English, and has done lots of marvelous work with 19th century science and humanities, and that's all I'll say, Laura.
So I'm supposed to turn this on. Looks like that is. Okay, I'm hearing. Good. Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you for organizing this. I know there's a lot of Humboldt 250th events happening around the world, and one of my issues has always been what happened to Humboldt in the United States. So to have United States also recognizing Humboldt, so far there's been one that I know about in Chicago, the Chicago Map Society, and Sister Cities did one a couple weeks ago. I was out at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. They had a wonderful 250th, very much like this one. And I hope there are others that I haven't heard about, but it's really a thrill. So thank you, Dan, for pulling together, and thank you, Jamie, for helping, and to the Forest History Society and to Duke. And always these events take a lot of time to put together and a lot of sponsorship, so I'm appreciative of all of you. And how do I advance this? Is this? No. This. Maybe, yes. Okay, that's not portable. I'll have to. Is there a gizmo?
There is a gizmo. Yes.
Is that? Okay. So that advances.
Right.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So, the introduction, a return to Humboldt's Bridge. A decade ago, I opened my book on Humboldt, The Passage to Cosmos, by calling this engraving an image of separation and connection iconic of all of Humboldt's work. In Europe, he tells us, we might think the mountains are what stagger the imagination, but in the Andes, it is the valleys that carve depth into the landscape, giving it a wild aspect that fills the soul with, Humboldt says, astonishment and terror. Putting on his geologist's hat, Putting on his geologist's hat, Humboldt speculates that this chasm was opened by an earthquake, which a single stratum of quartzose sandstone resisted, forming a natural bridge. Through it, 100 meters below, flows the Rio de la Suma Paz, the river of consummate peace. The lower bridge was formed when masses of rock tumbled into it in such a way as to support each other, held in place by the force of gravity and the architectonic principle of the arch. Humans know these bridges and use them. Don't fall off, cries that frail reed fence. The artist, down in the riverbed with the cave-dwelling birds, turns the experiential reality of man, mule, and bird, rock, river, and plants into a view, but it's an impossible view, truly. Humboldt made his field sketch from above, for the depths are inaccessible even today. The only way he could see into the abyss was to bounce rockets off the canyon sides and glimpse what he could see in the artificial glare. Only the imagination of the artist can vault us to the bottom of the dark chasm so that we might experience the depths and see and sense how these many worlds cross and connect just here and just this way, weaving together life on Earth. 10 years later, this same image evokes for me a far more uncertain sense, less of connection than of suspension. Behind us is the Earth we thought we knew, that stable platform for our vaunting dreams, an infinite resource to feed those dreams forever and for everyone. Yes, the great promise of modernity. But there's no going back to that old Earth. Today's Earth has awakened, as if alive, responding with terrifying speed to our fossil-fueled engines, our air-conditioned interiors, our plastic infrastructure, our overstuffed supermarkets. We all know the litany. In the grip of this new reality, we have named it after ourselves, the Anthropocene, that geological epoch when human actions have awakened an Earth that will never be silent again. As Isabel Stenger says, no future can be foreseen in which she will give back to us the liberty of ignoring her. We, the intellectual classes, argue how to apprehend this epoch and fill our shelves with books analyzing it, this great derangement in Amitav Ghosh's phrase. Yet for all this, we still don't know how to find passage to a future world that doesn't fill us with astonishment and terror. What's on the far side of this chasm? We cannot see it. We don't know how to imagine a future that doesn't merely repeat our past. True, just as Humboldt taught us, the old chasm between man and nature has closed. But the earthquake of the Anthropocene has opened a new chasm, this one dividing our past from our future, and it gives us no passage to any river of peace. Suspended over the abyss, unable to go back, terrified to look down, we hear too late the alarms sounded by the scientists of the earth. We hear too soon the drums of the apocalypse. We hear too much from politicians, too paralyzed with fear to help us move forward. Have we been here before? No, the scientists tell us. There is no analog for the crisis we face. But they offer a suggestive parallel. The great oxygenation event of 2.3 billion years ago, when Earth's dominant life forms were cyanobacteria here in fossilized form. The oxygen they produced as a toxic waste product of photosynthesis triggered a snowball Earth encased in ice that lasted over 300 million years and thus almost destroyed life itself. The key word is almost. New organisms evolved that metabolized that toxic gas. We call them animals. For the rest, as they say, is history, our history. We being, of course, their direct descendants. We owe our very existence to life's ability to adapt to conditions that life itself created. Thus, surely after billions of years of evolution, we are smarter than cyanobacteria. Surely we can control our own waste products before we too extinguish the conditions needed for life, or at least life as we know it. But there's something very interesting about this parallel. It highlights the fact that Earth has, since the beginning of life, been co-creating itself by living processes. The very atmosphere we breathe is the ongoing product of biochemistry, as it has been for 3.5 billion years and counting. Such work as this, it is through such work as this that geologists have fully integrated the history of life and of the planet into a single Earth system. In the 1970s, this kind of integrative insight led the microbiologist Lynn Margulis and the geochemist James Lovelock to propose a name for the biologically active Earth, Gaia. In the decades since, Earth system scientists have elaborated and explored this basic concept, and as their understanding grows, so has the question, have we been here before scientifically? Does this Gaia thinking have a precursor? The emerging consensus seems to be no. This is a qualitative shift, perhaps even a paradigm shift in scientific knowledge. Yet, perhaps so. Alexander von Humboldt. How very odd that one must work to recall his name. Was he not the most famous scientist of the 19th century? He who seeded all the disciplines, all the sciences of the living earth, who founded the very concept of the International Scientific Society. He whose popular science book, Cosmos, was an international bestseller. He who invented, some say, the very concept of nature. Here, I suspect that he who authored a history of the concept of nature, starting with ancient Hebrew and Indian poetry, would have demurred. I propose something else. Humboldt was our first theorist of planetarity, and what he invented was Gaia. And if you haven't heard of Humboldt, that's why. Humboldt's return to Earth. Our 21st century notion of Earth is indelibly shaped by the Apollo photographs of the 1960s and 70s. I'll never forget this image, the awed astonishment of this photo. Above the bleak and colorless barrens of the moon, Earthrise, the vastness of our world, the entirety of all our worlds presented as a milky sapphire hung in the illimitable darkness of space. And of course, we all knew that other Earth of the schoolroom globes we could spin like toys, the human projected world globe that organized the evening newscast and that Cold War leaders strove to claim entire. But if you could imagine never having held such a globe, never having seen a photograph like this, you'll be better able to appreciate Humboldt's innovation in Cosmos, where he first introduced Victorian audiences to the concept of Earth as a planet, a stellar body among the uncountable objects strewn across interstellar space. Humboldt, building on the popular fame he'd acquired by then as a writer of travel narratives, structured Cosmos as the ultimate voyage of discovery, leading us on an imaginary journey out to what he called the depths of space, from whence we gradually, in Humboldt's Victorian translator's words, gradually descend through the starry zone to our own terrestrial spheroid, circled by air and ocean. The novelty lies in Humboldt's direction of travel. After millennia of longing to ascend from Earth, to escape it, to reach for the stars, Humboldt asks us instead to descend to our own planet in order to see it for the first time as a planet. We are invited to see a new world, more to inhabit a new cosmology that does not divide us from the heavens, but connects us with them, linking the realms of infinity with the swarms of, quoting from him again, minute, microscopic animal and vegetable organisms which exist in standing waters and on the weather-beaten surface of our rocks. As the cultural theorist Peter Sloterdijk writes, Earth becomes the star to which we return. Or as Henry David Thoreau said, after reading Cosmos, we walk on some star's surface. How then do we know Cosmos today as merely another word for the stars, as if to look to the heavens were to mean turning away from Earth? In 1980, the Apollo generation experienced Humboldt's voyage to interstellar space by way of Carl Sagan's delightfully schmaltzy, I hope I'm not insulting anybody, TV show, which I remember and loved. Recently upgraded by Neil deGrasse Tyson's 2014 remake, both of them under Humboldt's original title, Cosmos. Though his vision of Earth placed it in the regions of space, Humboldt was truly earthbound. Sagan's and Neil deGrasse Tyson's emphasis was on the stars, yet Humboldt was neither astronomer nor astrophysicist. As he told a friend, a man who is, as I am, like an insect, inseparable from the earth and its natural variations, feels himself uneasy and constrained at abstract assertions. So his stated goal was not to lure us out to the stars, but to break us away from the subjective point of view, he called it, of human interests, to defamiliarize our terrestrial home so that we might recognize as we approach it through what he also called the great garden of the universe, teeming and throbbing with stellar objects in all stages of evolution, the richness of Earth's individual parts, the fullness of physical phenomena, and the heterogeneous properties of matter. Oh, and that was only volume 1. In volume 2, Humboldt took us on a second journey, this one through the human horizons of time, tracing the very concept of nature from the earliest antiquity to his own contemporaries. For after all, how could a description of the physical universe fail to include a description of the universe of mind? As Humboldt wrote, man elaborates within himself the materials presented to him by the senses, and the products of this spiritual labor belong as essentially to the domain of cosmos as do the phenomena of the external world. And there was still more. There must be details, updates, new insights. Humboldt spent the rest of his life expanding cosmos to embrace the fullness of his vision. After writing volumes 3 and 4 on the stars, in 1859 he embarked at last on volume 5, Home at Last. But death arrested his hand amid the basalts of Russia, suspended his vision of the growth and unfolding of life. Generations to come knew Humboldt only as a writer on the stars. He never finished his journey to Earth. That said, what he did accomplish is stunning. Humboldt opened to modernity a concrete and detailed vision of Earth as a living planet, and of the planet as a category of human thought. As he explained, while from outer space, Earth may appear only like a handful of conglomerated matter in the immeasurable universe, on closer look, its system of cooperating forces shows the dependence of every part of nature upon other parts, integrated from the most elementary inorganic processes to all the organic relations that bring into play forces responsible for the production and maintenance of life. But Humboldt insists that approaching Earth from space doesn't just mean zooming in for a closer look. It means shifting to a completely different kind of knowledge. True, in looking upward, we can pretend that celestial bodies are composed of undifferentiated matter, evidencing a sublime and immutable mechanical order mathematized by Newton's laws. But Humboldt argues that radical simplifications such as this can't help us understand the surface of the planet we inhabit. Down on Earth, the actual material differences of matter and its complicated interplay of forces do literally matter. To study them, he writes, is to bring all our senses into play, sharpens our minds, and to call into action every manifestation of intellectual progress. For while the sphere of the heavens can teach us very little about Earth, knowledge of Earth can tell us volumes about the true nature of the cosmos, which is composed of Earth stuff, the very same planetary matter we walk on every day. Thus, only the earthbound can hope to understand the heavens. So to understand Humboldt means abolishing the binaries that structure our thinking. First, he begs of us, put away your Newton and open your cosmos. Newtonian science detaches subject from object, particular lived experience from abstract universal laws. But Humboldt's science calls for total immersion. He must burn his feet in volcanic craters. He must handle electric eels to feel their shock. He must taste the curare mixed by those Amazonian elders. He demands a new situation for the observer as well as for what is observed. True, as he writes, amid the plastic and creative energy of the whole of the organic world, amid the metamorphoses of matter which exhibits an ever-active appearance of creation and annihilation, the human mind, ever striving to grasp at order, often yearns for simple laws of motion. But terrestrial nature makes very different demands. Its interdependent system of cooperating forces means that we're interwoven with our subject, embedded in it, physically, intellectually, emotionally. Humboldt insists this is not a seduction to be resisted, but an invitation to be accepted. As he writes, the appreciation of nature is excited in the susceptible mind of many through the profound impression awakened by the manifestation of these forces. Opening ourselves to nature's profound impress, his word, upon us, initiates creativity in both sciences and the arts. From our elemental awe at the size and mass of the earth, to the astonishing diversity of the land and its inhabitants, to the manifold workings of the human mind itself, the very mind that traverses the planet. This, by the way, is Rainy Day in the Tropics by Frederick Edwin Church, and Church was inspired to travel to the tropics and attempt canvases like this by reading Humboldt's Cosmos. Second, Humboldt acknowledges that convention divides the terrestrial sphere into two domains, organic and inorganic. But for his purposes, this ancient division will no longer serve. He writes, the history of organisms is so intimately connected with geology, with the order of succession of the superimposed terrestrial strata, and with the chronometrical annals of the upheaval of continents and mountains, that I will avoid establishing the natural division of organic and inorganic terrestrial life as the main element of classification. In other words, since Earth makes no such divide, neither will he. He writes, we are not here striving to give a mere morphological representation of the organic world, but rather to arrive at bold and comprehensive views of nature and the forces which she brings into play. Third, while continents, oceans, and atmosphere may be separable elements of the Earth's surface, here too one may distinguish them only in order to trace their intimate interplay. Continents cannot be understood apart from their, quoting again, intimate connection and reciprocal action with the encircling sea, which is again, quote, covered by the atmosphere, an aerial ocean, in which the mountain chains and high plains of the dry lands rise like shoals, occasioning a variety of currents and changes of temperature, collecting vapor from the region of clouds, and distributing life and motion by the action of the streams of water which flows from their declivities. Now you see why I chose this image to illustrate Humboldt's words. The geography of plants and animals, he continues, depends on these intricate relations of the distribution of sea and land, the configurations of the surface, the direction of isothermal lines which trace global temperature gradients. But for the human race, geography also depends on the nature and progress of civilization, including economic and intellectual exchanges, and the moral and intellectual cultivation which shapes and is shaped by political progress. Thus, Humboldt's unity of view encompasses everything from deep earth processes to the action on its surface, to atmospheric meteorology, to the historical migrations of plants, animals, and peoples, to the unity of the human races, which, as he admonishes us, are, quote, in like degree, designed for freedom. Humboldt's planet, the critical zone. Well, what kind of a planet is this? In 1799, writing feverishly to a friend on the eve of sailing to the Americas, Humboldt sketched his vision. I shall collect plants and animals and make astronomic observations, but that's not the main purpose of my expedition. I shall try to find out how the forces of nature interact upon one another and how the geographic environment influences plant and animal life. In other words, I must find out about the unity of nature. 8 years later, he ventured a graphic image of this unity in his Tableau Physique, illustrating one of his earliest books, Essay on the Geography of Plants, in 1807. The enormous engraving, nearly a meter wide, centers on Chimborazo, the mightiest of the Andean volcanoes, then thought to be the highest peak in the world. Vegetation maps the terrain by altitude, zone by zone, rather like geological strata, from equatorial jungle to polar ice. In the cutaway, plant names arc up the mountainsides from subterranean depths to alpine heights. Puffy cumulus clouds wreathe the mountains under high, thin cirrus, graced in this plate, well, actually not in this plate, in others I've seen, by flying birds and marked by the highest points yet reached by men in balloons. Behind Chimborazo, the violent peak of Cotopaxi smokes ominously. The image is braced by columns of facts and statistics, typical animals, cultivated crops, temperatures, air pressures, light refraction, the blueness of the sky, all correlated by altitude, exploring the varying degrees of coupling between living and non-living systems, points of tangency where anthropology, biology, and geography intersect. Humboldt's genius was to fold the elevation of the mountain onto the latitude of the planet from equator to poles, showing how each of us can experience the planet in place. For Humboldt, to think like a planet is to think like a mountain. How to represent this? His experiment in graphics is nothing less than an exercise in cosmography, calling in the artistic imagination to aid a new scientific concept. What to call this? In Cosmos, Humboldt regrets that the science for which he here provided the rough materials had yet to be named. After 4 decades, his terrestrial planet was still unbaptized. In effect, then, Cosmos is a vast expansion of Humboldt's 1807 tableau, from celestial stars above to Earth's molten core beneath. But his tableau makes clear what the half-finished Cosmos cannot. What truly matters is the inexhaustible treasure of this heterogeneous zone of matter, which can only be found here, on the surface of the planet which we inhabit, where all the forces and potentials of the universe meet and mingle to generate the zone of life. Earth system scientists have now given us a name for Humboldt's planet: the critical zone, the thin and porous layer, just a few kilometers thick, where in Humboldt's, quoting some Earth scientists, where life has modified the cycles of matter, a kind of skin, a varnish, a biofilm. Like Humboldt, these scientists are struck by the radical difference between the nature knowledge of stars and Earth. Like them, Humboldt draws our attention to what Humboldt calls the limited boundaries of that portion of space from which we derive all our knowledge of material nature, a narrow zone somewhat inappropriately termed, he says, the Earth's crust. This zone, by Humboldt's reckoning, extends from coal seams deep underground to the tips of the highest peaks, a distance of 37,000 feet, he marvels, just 524th of Earth's radius. Within this narrow zone, though, life abounds everywhere. Why? With his own eyes, Humboldt has seen living organisms from the depths of caves and mines to the summits of the Alps, even life within life, as the microscope reveals animalcules in the blood of frogs and salmon, and microorganisms in the oceans and the polar ice. As he writes, the sphere of vitality, we might almost say the horizon of life, has been expanded before our eyes. Nor is this life just merely embedded inside an environment. Humboldt shows how living organisms generate their own environment or climate through the reciprocal action of all elements composing this horizon of life. For while we may associate climate only with the atmosphere, Humboldt tells us that it also involves the perpetually concurrent influences of the ocean and of radiation from dry land, depending on whether the land is barren or grassy or forested. Thus, knowledge of the reciprocal action of air, sea, and land, he writes, teaches us that great meteorological phenomena cannot be comprehended apart from the structure and nature of Earth, or what he elsewhere calls the planetary organism. What is at stake in Humboldt's turn to what his descendants are calling the critical zone? As Bruno Latour puts it, speak of nature in general as much as you like, wonder at the immensity of the universe. This will not change the fact that everything that concerns you resides in this minuscule critical zone. Scientists note that the fragility of this zone and its reactivity to human actions have recently become the central topics of the multidisciplinary research around the disputed concept of the Anthropocene. But the key concept of the Anthropocene, the sensitivity of Earth systems to human actions, is an outgrowth of Humboldt's own logic. To put it in 21st century terms, the critical zone has progressively been engineered by life forms which learned over the eons how to use the sun and deep earth energy to transform matter, thus unexpectedly creating the conditions necessary for other life forms to subsist, life within life. In this maelstrom in which we all live, what is central is not the stability of Newtonian cyclical order, but migratory states, each with its own movements, weaving atoms and organisms together. Here's how Humboldt puts the same very contemporary insight. Metamorphosis, union, and separation afford evidence of the eternal circulation of the elements in inorganic nature, no less than in the living cells of plants and animals. We thus find a verification of the ancient axiom of Anaxagoras that created things neither increase nor decrease in the universe, and that which the Greeks termed the destruction of matter was a mere separation of parts. Our earthly sphere, within which is comprised all that portion of the organic, physical world, which is accessible to our observation, is apparently a laboratory of death and decay. But that great natural process of slow combustion, which we call decay, does not terminate in annihilation. The liberated bodies combine to form other structures, and through the agency of the active forces which are incorporated in them, a new life germinates in the bosom of the earth. Close quote. The key, that is, must lie in understanding how all elements circulate, even while constantly being taken up by chemical and biological processes being worked out in soil science at that point by Humboldt's colleague Justus von Liebig. As Humboldt suggests, this makes time, temporality, and hence history central to any understanding of the critical zone, and hence to any adequate understanding of the earth we inhabit, including how we might consciously learn to inhabit it in the future we are so unconsciously destroying. Humboldt's Gaia. Well, this is no doubt a very odd kind of science. What to call it? Physical geography won't do, fretted Humboldt, because his work, the work of my life, he wrote a friend, was no mere physical description of the earth, but it comprises heaven and earth, everything existing, he says. The whole material world with all of its parts, all sizes, from nebular stars to the mosses on the granite rocks. He'd need a catchy title, something both instructive and attractive. For a long time he fretted. He hesitated between two possibilities before finally choosing Cosmos. Even though it was, he worried, far too pretentious. But introducing this forgotten word from the ancient Greek did have an advantage. It said that in one and the same striking word, he wrote, heaven and earth. And besides, his other choice had already been scooped by a rival, a certain Professor Zoyne, for a book that Humboldt disliked, Gaia. Today's critical zone thinking emerged not from Humboldt's Cosmos, but from the concept of Gaia, originally formulated in the 1970s by Margulis and Lovelock. In a recent essay, Tim Lenton, a student of Lovelock's, joins Bruno Latour in calling for Gaia 2.0, in which human action, instead of being unconsciously destructive, becomes consciously constructive. That is, to find a way to a future, they offer, we must become partners with Gaia, operating with and within its constraints. Here is where Humboldt might be most helpful. He resurrected that obsolete Greek word cosmos out of his conviction that humanity comes into being exactly insofar as we know ourselves to be a conscious thinking partner with the physical universe. That is, the vastness of the physical universe does exist quite independently of us, but it exists as a cosmos, both ordered and beautiful, through the receptive participation of the human mind. Humboldt's cosmos is developmental and dynamic, emerging and growing as our intellectual and emotional sensitivity to nature enlarges and deepens. As a narrative, it's still being written. As a picture or view, or Ansichten, Humboldt's favorite metaphor, it comes into being as we paint it and as we respond to it. It's notable that Humboldt and Lovelock arrived at their respective insights from opposite directions. Lovelock, while working for Carl Sagan's team at NASA, was tasked with answering whether life exists on Mars. No, he responded, just look at it. From Earth, we can see the atmosphere of Mars is chemically stable, while from beyond Earth, we can see the atmosphere of Earth is not. Yet despite its instability, Earth maintains a temperature within a zone suitable for life. Thus, Mars in chemical equilibrium is a dead planet. Earth in perpetual disequilibrium is self-regulating, hence, in a real sense, alive. By contrast, Humboldt saw the Earth not from beyond, but from within, literally. He began his professional life as a mining engineer. Down in those Prussian coal mines, he could see the planet was composed not of undifferentiated rocks, but of layers, strata, which preserved organic remains, layers of life, world upon world, extending from the present deep into unimaginably deep time. And the deeper the mine, the higher the temperature. He could feel how the seemingly placid Earth was molten at its core. And deep underneath, he found improbably plants. Were they the sources of the toxic air in the mines? His first task was to invent a gas mask to protect the miners and himself. His next task was scientific. What did plants contribute to the composition of the atmosphere? Did the atmosphere we breathe also have a history? Volcanic eruptions released tremendous quantities of carbon dioxide from the buried forests of the Carboniferous, he knew. Entire worlds of interdependent plant and animal life had flourished and perished. But how? His young friend, Louis Agassiz, was proposing that Earth's climate, that Earth had been covered in glaciers, a theory Humboldt found very hard to accept. He doesn't say no, but he can't quite bring himself to say yes. Thus, where Lovelock centers his inquiry on sunlight, Humboldt centered his on eruption of Earth's interior heat interacting with the cyclicity of biochemical processes in what we're now calling the critical zone. All in all, what struck Humboldt was not, as for Lovelock, a homeostatic planet, but a planet in perpetual turmoil, an unquiet planet where all life was fragile, precarious, a self-creating planet to be sure, but with no guarantees of constancy. What could the role of humans be on such an unquiet planet? Lovelock has compared humanity to a disease, spreading and destroying the very conditions that nourish it. Humboldt knew the side of humanity all too well, which he documented in his writings, hoping we might learn from our folly. But he could also imagine a more utopian possibility, for the interplay of planet and mind led him to a breakthrough insight. The terrain does not hide, but reveals the mode of its formation in its temporal depths. In a real way, we too are written in the rocks. And in the interest of time, I'm going to have a little excursion on language, which I'll skip over here, but perhaps we can circle back to it in discussion. No, Humboldt's Gaia isn't quite the same as Lovelock's. Where Lovelock's Gaia doesn't need us, Humboldt's does. Humans are an integral part of its expressiveness, reciprocally intertwined with its past, present, and future. And where Lovelock's Gaia is self-regulating, Humboldt's is in perpetual turmoil, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, glaciations, extinctions, invasions and conquests, libraries burned, all life precarious. Don't fall off, cries our frail technology. Indeed, Humboldt's Gaia is much closer to Gaia 2.0, which incorporates the human as a self-aware element of Gaia's self-regulation, or at least potentially so were we to make our choices as conscious partners within a biodiverse, life-sustaining Earth system. So here's perhaps the most telling difference. Humboldt expects enlightened politicians will collaborate with scientists who, by expanding the human sensorium, will alert us to our errors in time to make mid-course corrections. Only Humboldt were right. It's true Humboldt wrote for his moment, which is not ours. It's true we historians are fond of continuity and discovering precursors, yet I remain struck by how complete and exact was Humboldt's theorization of Gaia, even without today's technical language, let alone the massive investment in earth sciences which emerged, could we say, as a consequence of, not merely subsequent to, his investigation. So let me put it this way. Suppose Humboldt was in fact proposing not a new phenomenon, one more book on the shelf, but a new way of looking at all phenomena. Suppose he did envision an entire research program, even a paradigm shift. His frenzied energy, his impossible ambition, his global network of correspondence, his growing loneliness and disappointment as he aged. One might read all these as the signature of an intellect consumed with a vision of science, even of politics and the arts, who lived long enough to watch as the future swerved in a very different direction, one he could not unswerve, though he literally died trying. What if we were to read Humboldt through our language of Gaia? Would we not see in him a vision of Gaia unshadowed by the Anthropocene? Last piece here. The curious feature of all discussions of Humboldt, at least in the United States, is that for all of his importance, most of the audience won't know who he was. Thus, discussions of Humboldt commonly end by asking, whatever happened to him? How did we forget him? Elsewhere, I've offered a dozen answers to this question. Here I'll offer only one. The paradigm shift Humboldt attempted failed, and its failure eclipsed him from our view. What took shape instead were first, ever narrower scientific specialties delimited by professionals who dismissed Humboldt's cosmos as too quaint to be useful. Second, the emergence of ever more ferocious forms of ethnic nationalism and imperialism that shredded Humboldt's cosmopolitan conviviality in the vortices of imperial war. And third, the withdrawal of the arts from Humboldt's extravagantly cosmic and non-linear assemblages to the elaboration of moral narratives centering on the travails of the human subject. Oh, we do still live in Humboldt's world, but we live it in shreds and fragments. That is, Cosmos was recalled in both senses of the word, recollected by many as the sign of a vanishing time, revoked by many more as irrelevant to the project of the modern world. When Humboldt returned from the Americas, he settled down not back home in Berlin, but in cosmopolitan Paris, there suspended halfway between hearth and cosmos. He could attend to the emergence of his new aesthetics. His science would be tactile, immersive, turned outward to the plural surprise of what William James would call radical empiricism. His politics would insist on severing the chains that bound master and slave. His art would project nature as, in Humboldt's words, a free domain, one in which agency distributed among all forms of life would bind us all with reciprocal ties of dependency, while chance and novelty would continue to generate new yet ever more intricate and fragile ways of sustaining and being sustained by the horizon of life. Cosmos offered Humboldt a way forward, a way we might think through Gaia, as partners and lovers, not guilt-ridden, oblivious destroyers. Might his cosmos do the same for us? Might it be recalled in a third sense, summoned out of the past to aid us in the present, a return that might incite a new way of sustaining and being sustained by the horizon of life? Thanks. All right. We have time for like one. Absolutely. I think maybe one, if there's a point that is unclear or that you just want to catch up before we go to the next, and we'll have time for discussion once the three of us have all spoken. But is somebody
We're
thinking?
flexible. Go ahead. One question. Yes.
Yeah.
Good idea.
Just point of urgency. Anyone? Or you want to just let it simmer for a bit?
Oh, why? Yeah. Nobody? I do.
Oh, okay. Dan has a point of emergency.
Why the insistence in Cosmos of top to bottom, coming to Earth? He was very insistent upon that, and you brought that up. Why?
Yeah, because, well, it would have been a turnaround of the familiar. This is the sublunary, right? The contemptible world that you would aspire to leave to go to the heavens, and of course this gets translated in kind of aspiration to the stars, which is my reference to. I mean, again, Sagan and Neil deGrasse Tyson bring us to Earth, but we remember that just looking at the imagery, what we remember them for is the sort of stellar, the marvelous stars. So by turning us around back to the orientation like the Apollo photograph, what you've got is the marvel of seeing the moon as your footing and looking at Earth. Suddenly it's a star, but again, the star to which we return, and that defamiliarization that now you see it. This is why I want to call him the first planetary theorist, because it's that turn where the shock of seeing, the mundane familiar in this new way energizes a whole new way of thinking. And so he's got to take us out and then slowly move us closer and closer and closer until this kind of magical moment when suddenly we're actually walking on a planet, and it's this shiver of it's like we're space travelers and we've landed for the first time and it's home, but we never saw it before. So now we have a question. Stina?
Our second speaker is Nicholas Rupke from Göttingen. Is that approximately correct? Göttingen. Where he spent, I believe, most of his scholarly career. Mandatory retirement made the energetic gentleman look around, and he's now working at Washington and Lee. And so he's our second speaker. the author of a very interesting meta-biography of not too many years ago. Thank you very much, Nicholas.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, not only to such a splendid occasion, and such a sort of worthy occasion as well, but also, of course, these magnificent surroundings here, nature as well as architecture in which we are encased here. So thank you very much. I had a little bit of difficulty finding it because of the spaghetti of streets and highways, but here we are. So thank you very much for including me in this event. Yes, indeed, for the bar to clear with Laura's talk having been the first, which is not only just as a scholarship as always, a magnificent piece of scholarly inquiry, but also an artistic demonstration of the aesthetic sensibilities that are part of Humboldtianism and always have been. So that is something to follow. I shall not try to compete with that and therefore do something totally different. First, I have simply assumed that not many of you have read my meta-biography of Humboldt from A to Z. Most of you perhaps even have no idea what it means to talk about a meta-biography of Humboldt. And therefore, let me just talk about that, and then towards the end, do what Laura already so magnificently has done, is extend what we've done in the past to current issues of Humboldtianism and why we think he is relevant today, or even more than relevant, an inspiring figure today, a sort of international scientific hero. So just a bit first about the work I've done myself on Humboldt. The talk is about Humboldt meta-biography, but the first project on Humboldt I've done before the meta-biographical one was a systematic study of all the reviews, contemporary reviews of Alexander von Humboldt works. And of course, he had a colossal oeuvre. But there were a series of works, of which we have talked especially about Cosmos, but that's the last, a series of significant works that became internationally popular and influential, basically starting with his major work on Mexico, or New Mexico in those days, central Spain. And that work became a classic also for the Humboldt adulation in the Spanish-speaking world, as you can imagine. But that was his first famous work. There were several others, and so I did a systematic review of all the study of all the reviewing magazines across Europe, especially Britain, France, and Germany, looking at how Humboldt was received. And you see, quite interestingly, that that was not uniform in any way. There were national reviewing cultures, and then within nations, political reviewing cultures that clash with each other in assessing Alexander von Humboldt and his significance. So, ladies and gentlemen, that study, that systematic study, which was an enormous amount of paperwork, I should say, because the number of reviews published of Humboldt's work was quite staggering, very impressive. Some reviews were small booklets, so to speak. That work carried me into Humboldt biography because as Humboldt became more famous, the reviews of his works became small biographies of the man. So the more significant the work, the more interesting, of course, the life of that man. Where does he come from? What does he represent? Where does he stand on this issue or that issue? So that's how I got into Humboldt biography, and thought with the encouragement of my old patrons, Charles Gillespie at Princeton, and I should say Rudolf Vierhaus at Göttingen. Yes, here we have a youngish. I was already a bit older, actually, when I got my job in Göttingen. But here is a youngish historian of science who can give us the definitive Humboldt biography. And boy, had I grown up under the threatening pressure of that. While I was for some years at Oxford, the Oxford School of History believed in definitive biographies, and the buck stops here. So I thought I'll do that. So in order to start out, let's see what others have written about him, to begin with some of these reviews, where I had come across biographical accounts. That's what I did. And then, ladies and gentlemen, I got drowned in the secondary literature, which is a small library. And the question to me became not who is the real Humboldt, the definitive person for me to describe, or what's the definitive portrait to paint. The question to me became, what is this Humboldt phenomenon about? This industry, Humboldt und kein Ende. I think our meeting has a very kind reformulation by saying, not the Humboldt und kein Ende, but Humboldt forever with an exclamation mark. But, naja, okay. So that brought me then to Humboldt's biographical, what I increasingly recognized to be appropriations, and there were so many of them, as I just said. I had to restrict myself to the German-speaking world, but I looked at the English biographies, American, South American. There were even ones from India and other, and other parts of the world. That's what I'll be talking about now. That's where my monograph is based on that work. And then today, just as Laura is also carrying her Humboldt into the present, I'm trying to do that as well, but have no proper talk on that. I'll just describe what I'm doing with him now. So it's Humboldt's, Alexander von Humboldt's biographical appropriation in the German-speaking world that I shall characterize as meta-biography. And I start with this particular portrait for a purpose. It's not one that we know very well, but it was the best known in Germany during Alexander von Humboldt's lifetime and shortly after. This is what they wanted to see with their Humboldt. I'll come back to that in a minute, and its significance, Here, of course, very, very briefly, the very familiar facts. I only show them here so as to remind you quickly of some of the dates, titles, names that I will be dealing with. So Humboldt, of course, those years, not insignificant. 69, boy, they made, that was a year during which many famous Europeans were born, and it was seen by some as meaningful, of course. Bit of numerology there. And then in 1859 he dies, and that connects to my current work when Darwin, in a way, begins to replace Humboldt as the most celebrated European scientist. First, a booklet, that was the first that was reviewed. 1790 is relatively little for him, book on the mineralogy of basalts. But then his journey of exploration, of course, 1994. Then in Paris as Privatgelehrte, there he wastes his family fortune, or half of it. His brother Wilhelm had the other half. And then that enormous reisewerk, his travel account, the Voyage aux régions équinoxiales du Nouveau Continent. You hear I'm not French, Dutch I am, so I apologize for my Dutch accent with my French. And then the Ansichten der Natur, we all know that. This, you see, was his first internationally famous work, 1811, the Essai Politique, the political essay on New Mexico. That was reviewed widely and very favorably and had an enormous impact in how people saw and admired him. In a way, you see, it made him, of course, it was a political essay, not just nature, but also the politics, the culture, the history of Central America that fitted into the empire vision of people going out, you know, for the Brits mainly, usually, but also other European nations to explore for settlement purposes. And of course, the Dutch were not so much into settlement, but trading, economics, and so on. It served all those purposes. And then the more romantic personal narrative that Darwin was so influenced by, and then we get the Cosmos lectures, and later Cosmos, the 5 volumes, of which really only the first 2 volumes in the late 40s had an impact. The rest seemed to be, you know, how when people get quite old, they write up a last thick book that comprises the card catalog. Or what do we do now in the age of digital recording? Okay, sorry. But that's a little bit what the last 3 volumes were. Am I, Laura, am I being too, sort of applies. Now, here, ladies and gentlemen, this is what got me going in the direction of metabiography. And these are all the, well, in part the reviews, but then also the biographical accounts written of Humboldt from 1719, so that was that first reaction to his first publication on the mineralogy of these basalts. And then I began that project around 2000, and that's where I stopped. But you see, not only does the biographical literature increase, occasionally during commemorative events, there are enormous peaks of biographical accounts that go up to, gosh, well over 200, 1959, somewhere around 500 for sure. And this, ladies and gentlemen, has not abated. And you ask yourself, are we all the time discovering new things in the archives about Humboldt, things we didn't know? Huh? That assumption underlies when you do new work. But then it became clear to me. Now, we are recycling Humboldt all the time. Now, how to prove that and make it meaningful? Because in a certain way, people say, no, we know that. That's sort of true. But then, fortunately, German history is marked by very different periods of political regimes. Unlike Britain, unlike the US, unlike some other countries, Germany has gone to rather sharp changes of culture, of political and, broader speaking, intellectual culture. First, during Humboldt's own time, it was not a unified nation, just a sort of patchwork quilt of principalities and a few kingdoms. Then unified Germany under Bismarck and the Kaiser, the Kaiserreich. Then, of course, the Nazi period, another extremely sharply different period from past and what came later. Then East and West Germany, very different from the Nazi period, of course, good thing too, but also very different from each other, the two halves now, East and West. Fall of Berlin, fall of the wall of Berlin, and we have yet another different Germany. Huh? And I could quickly see, without looking at a date of any biography given to me, from which period of German history it was, because it reflected wholly different interests and questions to ask of the Humboldt material. So not only did each period create or appropriate Humboldt for create their own Humboldt and appropriate him for their purposes, not only that, but let me just see that. Sorry, I sometimes have too many, in my mind, too many subclauses to finish my sentence. So let me just apologize for that and continue here, that each of these periods of German history appropriated Humboldt for themselves, not necessarily by mythologizing anything, or lying about anything, or denying, as so often people in the present say when people in the past wrote different things from what you write. Huh? Oh, mythology, poor scholarship, not this and that. No. That didn't create the difference. The difference lay in having different interests in him, therefore selecting from the enormous amount of Humboldt's primary sources different materials and depicting them differently. And so that I could show by looking and categorizing collectively the Humboldt biographies of each of these periods of German history. And boy, does it work. It works amazingly. And that, of course, towards the end of my talk, will have to lead to what are we doing? But we'll come to that. So this is just the contents of my meta-biography. I start with this issue that Humboldt essentially has had several lives. I start with this Humboldt phenomenon that is enormous, all these publications, that really we have been all the time appropriating him for particular purposes, and that he was aware of that already, and he fashioned himself in pushing a certain autobiography. I deal with that too. But then we get the first real Humboldt. That is what I call the liberal Democrat before the Empire period. So he's still alive. How is he used? What is he used for? Let's be quite real. Not for climate issues. Hardly for climatology or, even the geography of the distribution of various phenomena around the world. We have made a big thing out of that, but not his contemporaries, I should say, by and large. That happens later, though. Other things, I'll come to that. So just briefly here, the different periods. Then you get the Wilhelmian and Weimar Humboldt. He is not so much a liberal Democrat who helps unify Germany, as in that first period when he's alive. When he's alive, he's a bit of a revolutionary and a liberal. Then he becomes a Kulturchauvinist. He's the great man who, along with his brother, now Wilhelm becomes essential. They represent German culture supremacy. They were late in the empire game. The Dutch were ahead of them, the Portuguese, then of course the Brits, even the French. The Germans were later. They said, we aren't these conquerors, we aren't these military people, we are a nation of culture, and our two symbols are Wilhelm and Alexander. I'll show you pictures of that. Then the Nazis have a different line, of course, and interest. They are interested in race. Racism is a big thing. I need not tell you about that. And their interest is in what blood makes up these Humboldts. And they do fantastic work in Humboldt genealogy and say he's an Aryan. So he's claimed also by the Nazis. That has always been said by everybody since then. Oh, how wrong. What a falsification. No, no. They produced the best genealogies of the Humboldts. And that's how they used him. So what was wrong was not the scholarship they did about him, but the exploitation, the instrumentalization of that for their own purposes. That's the issue. And then, of course, in East Germany, they made him a Marxist. I'll come to that very convincingly, by the way. And in West Germany, he becomes a cosmopolitan friend of the Jews, which he was too. He was. But not until then did that have political meaning to make him that sort of a person. This is the interesting thing. It's amazing to see that if you look at all these biographies, how the themes of Humboldt scholarship change. No mythologizing, no lying by and large. Gosh, there is better scholarship and worse, as always, in all these periods. But that's not what's changing. And then, of course, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, he becomes a globalizer. And I ended that book with Humboldt forever, Humboldt und kein Ende, the theme of our get-together here, in a sense. And that will bring us to a further discussion towards the end, perhaps, of what are we doing now. So let me specify this with a few points. I cannot give you all the details, of course. This is just a 40-minute lecture. So when I said during his lifetime, he was used actually as someone who took part in the liberal cause of German unification. So he becomes a national hero of the 48ers, the great 1848 revolution that fails. But then, how do they use him? Not his journey of exploration. Absolutely not. Not his great book on Mexico. No. Not his very influential travel account. No. What do they use? Cosmos. They make their peace, the Germans. They didn't like him much during his earlier years. They didn't glorify him that much. As a matter of fact, they put him down. Much of his early travels were put down in Germany as Jugendliteratur, something for young men to read that was healthy, but not to be taken seriously. You know, stories about mosquitoes on the Orinoco and so on, good for the boys, but not for Hegel and Schopenhauer und so weiter. It is not until Cosmos makes Humboldt a serious participant in German culture that he becomes a factor, and Cosmos becomes now, for its unitary, its unifying symbolism, a metonymy of the unification of Germany. Also, Humboldt, in giving these lectures, is somewhat liberal in encouraging a participation by women. And a few other things that indicated that Humboldt was a reform person, if not rather more than a reform person, perhaps close to the revolutionary ideology of 48 and so on. So let me show a few pictures. I shan't go through all that. So at the end, indeed, of his life, here he is depicted in a leading German magazine. Humboldt is being relieved by death from his burden of that totalitarian is the wrong term. That unifying cosmos concept that he had tried to put not just on the physical world, but also on things that were naturally to be unified, such as all those Germans who spoke the language of Goethe. And there we have him, you see, at this time. Now we get the friendship with Goethe being developed. I don't think he was, Goethe didn't think of Humboldt much more than as one of several clever boys he knew. Huh? But now Goethe becomes his friend, and of course here we have not only Goethe on the right there, but Schiller on the left. This is where Schiller in his garden in Jena, and then the Humboldt brothers in the back. Wilhelm is sitting, and Alexander holds his right arm tenderly around his brother's shoulder. Huh? That becomes a metonymy of German unity, which is around culture. And the Humboldts are part of this. And Humboldt, Alexander, was used for that together with his brother. So that is the essence of the early biographies you see written of Alexander. Are they wrong? No. But they are focused on contemporary interests. Huh? Here also, pictures now and stories and correspondence being published between Humboldt sitting there and Van Hagen von Ense, a rather well-known liberal political figure who was pushing anti-monarchistically and anti-clerically for German unification. Close friend of Humboldt. This becomes now also known. Huh? And the correspondence gets published no sooner than, and of course, Humboldt was well known to take part in von Ense's wife's soirees in Berlin, and then also another member of the Van Hagen von Ense family, Ludmilla Assing, and no sooner is Humboldt dead, then the rather scandalous liberal revolutionary correspondence between the two gets published. Huh? So, ladies and gentlemen, that's sort of, those are a few points that I'm highlighting here, saying that's the first batch of biographies and the first period of German history I'm talking about. Of course, between individual biographers, there are always differences in taste, in presentation, and so on, but these themes rule that group. And it's amazing how clear that is. And then he becomes the culture-chauvinist. As I've said, he undergoes identity changes in a way. Now, some are saying, gosh, you know, yeah, as a scientist, perhaps he was a bit too much of a generalist, as Laura has pointed out, not enough of a specialist, and that's a point of criticism. But then others try to say, but at least he was a Darwinian, which I shall greatly deny at the very end, because that connection I'm interested in for my own interest in evolution theory scholarship. But he becomes a culture nationalist, as I've said, and an envoy to Latin America. They discover in the Kaiserreich, now that Germany is unified, wow, with that Humboldt, whom they love in Central and South America and admire, we can do politics. And they do. And here you see first, here is the culture chauvinist with his brother, the two statues in front of what now is called the Humboldt University in Berlin. Alexander actually was the first, to get a statue, but people said, can't do that without Wilhelm. Took a while, but then they got the money. And here the statue, here in Mexico, Alexander von Humboldt, 1910, by the way, which still stands, I believe, in the center of Mexico City, and is a great reminder of that connection. So politics is now being done with it as well. Gosh, even today, but we'll come to that. Then we get the, I have time till 3 o'clock, huh? Is that correct? Yeah. Sorry? Yeah, okay, thank you. So, then, of course, we get the Nazis. They lay claim to him, too. They lay claim to as many famous figures of the German past to legitimize their own regime, of course. Gosh, the Nazis aren't the only ones who have done that, but boy, did they do that. And they are interested in Cosmos, but because it was written in German, whereas much of his other stuff was written in French. So a bit of nationalism there. And then they are interested in showing him as a typical Aryan and also as a friend of one of the Nazi figures who carried out a great deal of Latin American politics, Vogel. And here you see Wille und Macht. Gosh, you see the picture, you know, it's the Nazi period. Even the design can show you that. So there you get, you know, from the contents, Alexander von Humboldt, Bahnbrecher ins Weltganze. So there is the man of Cosmos. Yeah, it shows German thought that should be followed by German political power. German thought encompassing the cosmos of at least this world ought to be also political power. And that's how he's presented now. And here you have these Ahnentafel that the Germans made to examine and put forward in legitimation of leading figures, both from the past and the present. So Hitler got his Ahnentafel, of course, and other leading Nazis, but then also leading figures from the German cultural past. And if you couldn't get their Aryan background, then they weren't leading legitimate figures, if you see what I mean. So the Humboldt brothers become legitimated, and yeah, ladies and gentlemen, what is false in here? Not the work on the genealogy by and large. If we need information on Humboldt genealogy, we still use this work. I'm not aware of a better piece. What is wrong is the instrumentalization. But what I'm saying is, we've all in these different periods of Humboldt scholarship, have we instrumentalized him? Huh? And so, after and here Vaupels, Berlin, South America Institute, and then the East Germans, as I say, they make him an anti-slavery Marxist, so they make him a friend of the miners, the workers, things like that, an anti-slavery person in particular, make him friends with Foster. And so here, Neues Deutschland, the Pravda of the Communist Party in East Germany, mit Humboldts Geist eng verbunden. So on the front page during a particular commemorative year, the party leader says, we are closely connected with our Humboldt. He's us. He's a socialist. He's a Marxist. And here they are sitting, applauding that. You see, that is the party elite. You only have to look at the faces and the compulsive applause. And here, for all the kids in East Germany, they all had to learn about Humboldt, not only at university, but in school. And here is the first cartoon booklet about Humboldt and his life. And in one of these, on one of the pages, you see Humboldt here in the mine. He's a hands-on mining inspector, helping the poor chap and making sure that all goes well. And he even, as Laura said, he experimented, of course, about mining safety, looking at dangerous gases, and experimented on himself and had to be carried out once, unconscious, in service of the working class. One of us in the East. And of course, a great friend of Foster, can't go into the details, but he was a well-known revolutionary and so on. Of course, books, Foner, an historian here in New York. He wrote a book on Alexander von Humboldt and slavery, his opposition to slavery in the US. Couldn't get it published in the US in English, was then invited for a sabbatical to East Berlin and got it not only published in English, but translated into German and Spanish. Foner, I don't know how many of you are historians, he actually was a known figure in the left-wing movement here in New York Academia. But that's what he did there in East Germany. And of course, the East Germans, on another commemorative occasion, not now sent a statue, but paintings of Humboldt to, in this case, the Cuban embassy. So he's still an instrument in East Germany of politics. The West Germans at the same time, you see? Wholly different Humboldt, like wholly different. They westernize him. He is, of course, denazified. He becomes a cosmopolitan liberal, a friend of the Jews. This now is for the first time. And there is plenty material there to show that. But this is the first time this becomes of interest. This is extraordinary. Huh? And now he becomes half an American. This was new too. Yeah, we all knew he spent a couple of weeks in the US and actually gave away secrets to Jefferson, which some of the Latin Americans resent him for till this day, in colonial experiment. So that is what the West Germans do. Is this false? No. But boy, is Humboldt becoming a different man for the purposes of the West Germans. There we have, Adenauer, and there is the great Heisenberg, great physicist, of course, but he became a science politician after the war, the founder, first director of the Humboldt Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, what more successful organization of a nation to shake hands with other nations than using Humboldt's hand. And it's been a big success, the Humboldt Foundation. Don't we all like their prizes, their fellowships, or some other things? Huh? Especially if you're a young academic, you do well getting one. Huh? So, and they recognized that. They recognized Humboldt was the clean hand to make peace with the Brits, the Americans, and the Israelis. And boy, have they done it successfully. And it's ongoing, but now more broadly. And now they are taking part also in this climate Humboldt, who can shake anybody's hand around the world. We'll perhaps come to that if I have some minutes left. Oh yeah, so now we get suddenly pictures of Henrietta Hertz, those we hadn't seen before. Jewish, beautiful, serving another purpose, saying to the South Americans, he's not really gay, he liked her. Because that was coming up in West Germany now too. You could do that, before you couldn't do that. Huh? And then after the fall of the Berlin Wall, he becomes a green supranationalist. Free market is victorious. He's a globalization West German. The East Germans have to give in meekly. A green Humboldt, you get the Anglification, but you get also postmodernist cracks and the outing of Humboldt We have, for example, a major exhibition in Berlin, in the unified Germany, Netzwerke des Wissens, networks now, and now we get also his maps, and his isotherm lines become sort of republicized, put in the public eye. And we are using that now a great deal, of course, and you get pictures like this. Not the first picture with which I started. This is far more appropriate for our Humboldt now. And we get these pictures also, which you do not find in older biographies at all. And now you can't have a Humboldt publication without this. So, reflections and questions on metabiography. So, ladies and gentlemen, you see what I'm saying with metabiography. If you want to know Humboldt, you perhaps know most about him if you look at a lot of these biographies. Because every period has its own set of questions, its own interests, its own way of appropriating and instrumentalizing. What else are we doing today? We use him for a very important purpose, climate change. Correctly? Yeah, I'd say so. But it is also our Humboldt, rather than the definitive Humboldt. Do you know what I mean? And so when, with my book, I went to Vierhaus, the great historian in Göttingen, he looked at it, and he had tears in his eyes, and he said, I hope you will never publish this. And Gillespie, whom I'd mentioned too, as someone who wanted me to write a definitive biography, he says, I have a colleague who writes better work. That was all. But then, of course, one of the people in power at Yale University Press, which was interested, had been publishing my previous work and was interested in the biography as well. One colleague mentioned to block it there, and so I had some real difficulty getting this published because people were saying, relativism. We want the definitive biography. This is the relativism. I say, this is not relativism. I'm all for good, precise, factual scholarship. I do my best. I've read more publications than any of you. And I have documented in detail the reviews of, and so on. Who has done more accurate scholarship? This matters. But you cannot deny that all scholarship, especially biographical scholarship, even scientific work, comes from particular interests and is driven by particular questions which are time and culture and predilection, sensitivity, sensibilities dependent. You cannot deny that. So then the question becomes really, in the end, why not say, yes, that is the Humboldt whom we want. This Humboldt who saves the planet, who already saw that, deforestation was a dreadful thing to do and could have fatal consequences for humanity. Why don't we support that Humboldt? Why not lift him out in that way? I have no problem with that. It's not untrue. And in the meantime, we know what we are doing. No definitive Humboldt, this is not the one and only true one, but it's ours, and we need him. Now, perhaps, just a last point here. So, I'm not working at that at the moment. I have broadened some of my Humboldtian work, through Humboldt, I should say, into evolution theory that was pre-Darwinian, but also non-Darwinian. And I'm trying to do some stuff on that in a larger project of non-Darwinian evolution theory. Let me just end with one particular point that is amazing. And I think it is relevant in my analysis of cosmos and its significance for evolution theory, although the term evolution didn't exist yet, didn't even exist when Darwin wrote his Origin of Species. But that's how we refer to that thinking. So the amazing thing is, early on I said the only two volumes of Cosmos that mattered are volume 1 and 2. It's true. But read them. We've been talking about them, we always do, as if these are a major summary of contemporary science. Ladies and gentlemen, look carefully. I'd say if 2/5 of these two volumes deal with science rather than history, that's about it, huh? That's amazing. Now, what does that mean? Nobody has dealt with that. And I have a line on that that connects to my evolution thing, which I shall be talking about during a conference this weekend I'm organizing here at Washington and Lee on new perspectives on evolution. Thank you very much. By all means. Yeah. Thank you.
Max, thank you for the comment, but we'll take one actual question. And as a historian, God bless you for that comment, praising historians. Yes.
So, from another historian, we just had Andrea Wolf here to give a lecture to sum up the sort of events of this season for us. Interesting that her book has been treated as a definitive biography of Humboldt in English.
My son.
My son. My son. No names, just my son. Anyway, in your book, you talk about this Anglo-American Anglicization, you call it, of how the Darwin industry helped revive Humboldt for especially Anglo-American scholarship as his precursor. And do you see her work as more in that line, that she's part of that school? Because it is the emphasis on exploration and isochrones and all that, and the precursor to a connected Darwinian world. Do you see her as fitting into that, since you wrote that many years before she?
Yeah. You mean Andrea Wolf? Mm-hmm. Oh, most definitely, yeah, absolutely. When her book came out and people said, hey, is that sort of a bit competition with your work? They may have said it also to Laura. I said, what do you mean? It's confirmation. Because it does exactly what I would have expected. It's a brilliant statement of what we get out of him. Huh? And so, but perhaps I shouldn't comment too much on other current proximal authors of Humboldt.
I'll help you out a little bit and say that in many ways, what Wolf has achieved is elevating Humboldt's profile to the general public. We had a lecture a month ago that she presented, as you were saying, and we had about 200 people turn out. And the vast majority of them are not residents of the Ivory Tower. And so her work has reached out and been put in front of people. in some ways, I would equate her work to the difficulties many historians have with Ken Burns's films, which is he's putting history in front of people who don't typically read history. They don't want to read my converted dissertation or your converted dissertation, and we all know that a converted dissertation, if it sells 300 copies, you've got a bestseller. 30 of which your friends and family purchased. The rest went to libraries, and we're glad for that. But in both cases, they're reaching a public that we often are failing to reach. In the case of Nicholas's book and Laura's books, especially her more recent one on Thoreau, I know that the University of Chicago Press ran through their first printing before it got to the shelves. And they had to keep ordering more. And so as public historians like Matthew and myself, I will simply say that what Wolf has done, what Ken Burns has done, what Laura has achieved most recently is a rising tide lifts all boats. The more that we can get people to read history and good history, that what is good, what is bad is a different discussion, but it will benefit us all, generally speaking. There is a lot of hand-wringing right now about not understanding, not knowing our history, not knowing what the truth is, et cetera. Again, a different discussion. But if people are reading, people are watching, I'm glad. I'll go to a conference like this and debate the merits of the work, and that's fun for me. But my friends, their eyes glass over in a heartbeat if I start in on it. So with that, we'll take a 10-minute break. That was a great question. We'll take a 10-minute break. We'll come back. Elizabeth will then be presenting.
I'm reminded that how I got to know our next speaker from a Department of Philosophy, DePaul University, was through a suggestion from Laura Walls. And she was most enthusiastic about Elizabeth and her work. And also said, she will definitely come. and certainly that was what happened on email. But anyway, thank you, Laura, for that suggestion. Okay. Oh, was that it? Very good. Oh, fabulous.
Right. We had just taken a picture of ourselves in front of the archive, in front of our boyfriend, Humboldt, right? So
the floor is yours.
That tells you. All right. And thank you. And I just pushed the beginning? Okay. So thank you, first of all, thank you, Laura, for recommending me, and thank you, Dan, for organizing this. It's a terrific event, and of course, I believe that Humboldt deserves a big birthday party on his 250th, and I have been working on Humboldt. Laura and I met, I think, the very first time in Berlin, not last year, but many years ago, at a conference where she gave a beautiful paper. All of her work is beautiful, and not that anyone asked me, but as far as definitive accounts of Humboldt go, as someone working in the trenches, I would say it's Laura's book, The Passage to Cosmos, because and tell me when I think this is strange. Do I have to talk down into it like this? It's a little strange. Or can I just talk there? Yeah. Okay, and then can I take this off? Sorry, is this okay? I guess I'm like many academics shy anyway, so I don't like to hear my voice booming about. But in any case, I have been working on Humboldt for many years, and I do have a manuscript of this title, The Romantic Roots of Humboldt's Presentation of Nature. And I'll get into, well, a little bit of just an overview of why that project, again, after we've just heard that fascinating account of Humboldt biographies and how, in some ways, arbitrary the interest can be and the focus can be. I am a philosopher by training, working on Latin American philosophy, and also because at the time I was doing graduate work, I was told I would never get a job if I did Latin American philosophy. So I went to Germany with the day and came back with a dissertation on Schlegel. Not exactly a way to get a job, but I think you should just do. But I did get a job. I had to wait for an opening on early modern. I thought, well, Schlegel writes on Descartes, so maybe, and it worked. Right, I've never seen an opening for someone working on Schlegel while I was applying, nor since I applied, but one of my graduate students who wrote a dissertation on Schlegel also has a job. So anyway, that's, I don't do things just for positive outcomes. It's because I think there's something interesting there. And then my first job was in Venezuela, and I was so puzzled because I looked around Caracas, and I have a slide of the Pico de Humboldt. They had hairdressing salons named after Humboldt, any possible thing you can imagine named after Humboldt. And I didn't know anything about Humboldt. Then I went to a book fair and found his travel narrative. Now the translation that's interesting into Spanish was something like 5 volumes. If you look at the English translation, it's 1 thin volume. So that already told me a lot about the reception of Humboldt in the Spanish-speaking world, especially in Latin America, versus in the US. And then for me, this was a great discovery, right? Because I do Latin American philosophy and German philosophy, and here I found this German who's working in Latin America. So the political essays I find extremely important and underappreciated. And I was lucky enough to get a Humboldt Fellowship. So I was able, which is why I have this beautiful scarf with the AvH logo on it. And I started to see a lot of overlaps between Humboldt's work and the work of the early German Romantics. And again, well, I like underdogs. Schlegel was an underdog, the Romantics were. Now people are paying more attention to them. But the term romantic gets thrown around a lot. And once you've worked on that period and you see designations of romantic, it can get your radar way up and you can get irritated quite easily. So I decided to try to sort of track what the romantic elements of Humboldt's work was. Now, why do that? Is it just an esoteric historical enterprise? I did it, I think, and I'm going to just point, this is more of a sketch, just to point to some highlights here, because I saw coming out of that project a case for the relevance of Humboldt too, and a case for understanding how we can now, in 2019, teach people the way Humboldt really was primarily a teacher, I think, of appreciating nature, teach people to appreciate nature again. So looking at that project as one line of thought I have in the manuscript is Humboldt is kind of romantic critic of nature. And that was interesting the first time I presented that at the archive in Berlin, where there are a lot of scientists. Ulrike Leitner, for example, she looked at me very confused and said, well, critical of nature, Humboldt loved nature. I said, well, yeah, but that's not what I mean by critic of nature. And again, each discipline has their own terminology, and I think that's part of the problem we get with Humboldt too, because he was a truly Renaissance thinker, so he was talking to many different people during his period, but we have to learn how to translate his language to the language that can cross boundaries today too. And I think even finding an audience for the work I'm doing is a little difficult because philosophers are expecting different accounts, because if you mention, as I'm going to lead with this idea of freedom, we're not going to find a theory of freedom in Humboldt's work. So do I just click? Which part do I click to get it to move? Because there, no, I just turned it off. It's not, Oh, right side, okay, thank you, easy. Okay, so anyway, I just start with a familiar face there too, the young and the old. I focus in my work on Sichten der Natur, views of nature and cosmos, in part because, as we've heard from the 2 other speakers, Humboldt is writing mainly in French. His American writings are all in French. The Ansichten and Cosmos are both in German. Now, what does that mean? I think it does mean something, and it means something that Ansichten, he described as his favorite publication. I also think, because I'm wanting to situate him within the philosophical context of early German Romanticism, the German language writings have significance. And it's taking me so long to do this anyway. If I tried to do all of his writings, there would be no end, and I would be like that nice portrait we saw in the last presentation of, passing my manuscript over to death, right? And a good deal. That may be the case. I'm not so sure. I hope not. So here I just have these are the texts really that I find most relevant for his presentation of nature. What I find particularly important is the second bullet point there, because, fine, for someone not steeped in this period, those are just dates and places, right? But he's going to the heart of early German Romanticism, which I'm not going to give you a lecture, I promise, on early German Romanticism, but 1794 is a really important date. It's the date of the publication of Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre, which it's always hard, and that's another interesting historical point here. How do you mark periods? When does early German Romanticism begin and end? Part of that is arbitrary, but I think, with Romanticism, what I do is I link it to the publication of Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre, because that is the philosophical event that really shapes the early German Romantics. They're resisting Fichte's philosophy, and that would be too long a story for right now, and then I end it at 1808 when Schlegel converts to Catholicism, because that marks an end too, and then he goes to Vienna. So it's a short period, but it's marked by these revolutionary innovations in thought, which are shared in many important ways by Humboldt. So, and he's meeting with them in this period. And we had in the last presentation that very nice portrait of the Humboldt brothers sitting with Goethe and Schiller in the garden there in Weimar. And those connections are not just biographical moments, fleeting moments. Later on, Humboldt will also, at the invitation of Schiller, write a rather rare, strange, I say, essay for Die Huren, which he publishes in Ansichten der Natur, on the Rhodische Genius, on life force. I still haven't figured that one out. I love what you say about that in the introduction to your Ansichten volume. That is still a mystery to me. I've tried to penetrate that. I like how you leave it at its poetic allegory, and somehow not fitting. But anyway, life force is a very important point for Humboldt. And he's talking, then of course, the important voyage he takes, we've talked about 1799 to 1804, coming back to Paris, and then I have just some references here to Goethe too, because again, he's figuring in these publications. It's one of his publications in this period is dedicated to Goethe, and it has been described as a kind of companion piece to Goethe's Geographie der Pflanzen. So we have the Ansichten der Natur, and then he comes back to Berlin, which, as we all know, he was not happy to do. He had depleted his finances. He couldn't stay in Paris. He considered Berlin a kind of, which is hard for us to imagine these days, I think, cultural kind of wasteland. But he comes back, and then he is working on Cosmos. So, and we don't need to revisit that. I just like this map. It sort of shows us this very, and for me, this is kind of the heart, not that this is a narcissistic journey, but the heart of what draws me to him. He's so central to the intellectual heart of the Romantic movement. And he's also off, despite the Eurocentric views of people like Hegel. And one of my favorite chapters in my manuscript is the the critique he has of Hegel. You know, Hegel's lectures on history, where I start that by imagine sitting in a lecture hall listening to this person go on about America, and he's never stepped foot in America. And then you have a really nice, and that was thanks to the archives in Berlin, a very nice to and fro, not between Humboldt and Hegel, of course, but between Humboldt and someone else talking about Hegel, saying these things about America. Because here is somebody who's stepped foot in America and knows the reality of America, and what he's saying is very different from what Hegel is saying about America, never having stepped foot in the place at all, never having read very carefully, if at all, what Humboldt had to say. So here you have someone writing about this because he's traveled there, and immediately upon starting to read Humboldt with any care, one understands why, despite the colonial history that plagues that region, there are statues of him in Mexico. There are picos or peaks, mountain peaks named after him. He's a beloved figure there, which doesn't make much sense at first glance, because it seems, okay, this was Spanish America, and now these are independent countries. Don't they want to break from all of that past? But Humboldt's not part of that colonial past at all, which is why Mary Louise Pratt's account of some of what Humboldt is doing, I can see some of her points, but he is not, and Laura puts that very beautifully, not just one more imperial eye roving about America. He is actually breaking from that, which is why he also attracted me and why I think he's very relevant for us today, especially with the new breed of anti-Americanism that is cropping up. So what really, and this is a simple enough claim, right? He claims in Cosmos that nature is the realm of freedom. He claims it there. It's implicit in many of his writings. Now, of course, for a philosopher, that word is going to be vexing, right? And I'm going to be spending a long time, have spent a long time trying to figure out what on earth that means. More to the point, this question, how is a scientist to present the realm of freedom? Because we know, and that's any account of Humboldt is going to include, as Laura's tableau slide beautifully illustrates, empirical detail. So how do you get that empirical detail? Tools, measurements. He's going all around the Kingdom of New Spain, all around colonial Spanish America with instruments. He needs to measure everything, and he wants that measurement, as we'll see, because he says here that you have this common challenge facing those who want to present nature. Now, what I find also compelling and very interesting and important today for us in these days where we don't have enough discussions like the ones we're having here, which bring scientists together with humanists, that there are similarities between the two groups. And he puts it very beautifully. He says, in scientific circles, as in the circles of landscape poetry and painting, the presentation gains clarity and objective liveliness. That's very important to him, too, the liveliness. There are all sorts of trails you could follow in Humboldt just with the term Leben and Lebendigkeit, when the parts are determined and limited. So he does want to engage our emotions, and Laura made that point very nicely, and he is presencing in his work the beauty and grandeur and emotions that we feel in the enjoyment of nature. But he doesn't, it's not run wild. He wants it contained in some way. So there is, I'll get to that soon. What I found very useful in understanding Humboldt is a kind of what I call a romantic balancing act between the freedom of nature and all those life forces that are kind of spilling out in an unruly way, and then the domination of nature through the empirical methods. It's this balancing of the two, knowing that he can dominate nature in some ways through the measurements, but that there's more left over, and that's where the aesthetic steps in. And he says that humans, you need the empirical because humans cannot have any effect on nature, get close to any of her powers if they do not have knowledge of the laws of nature according to the relations of measurements and data. So that's clear. I guess I always feel I need to emphasize that because I've talked about Humboldt to scientists before, and when you start pushing the aesthetic, they sometimes seem to get nervous that you're kind of pulling the scientific hat off of Humboldt's head, which is the last thing I'm doing. What I think is recovered, in a sense, by putting him into the context of the early German Romantics is that you start to see that the aesthetic and the scientific are not at odds with each other. It's not an either-or sort of scenario. You can be both. And that's where I find Schlegel helpful, as we'll see. So he's always, we heard already about the unity in his work. And I'm not so happy with this word rationally here with the translation, because in the German you see Die Natur ist für die denkende Betrachtung. That's not exactly rationally, but I'm just keeping that there. Maybe I'm always altering translations, except for the beautiful new translation of Views of Nature. Don't have to alter that translation, thankfully, so thank you. But, that's not to say I don't appreciate these translations. As we were talking about earlier this morning, it's important to note that at a time when women were not welcomed with open arms into academia, a lot of the early translations were done by women. So I don't want to dismiss those in any stretch at all, but sometimes they are missing the mark in important ways. But I'm happy that they're there, and I'm happy that these very good intellects were able to bring these books to us. And as we'll talk about later too, which is something we're going to have to discuss, is I love that the chart that was just presented to us about when numbers peak in terms of biographies and work on Humboldt. But it is interesting to think, I don't think that Humboldt's neglect was a problem of bad translations, because the translations that existed were faulty, but that wasn't the thing keeping, I think, people away from Humboldt. So nature considered rationally, that is to say, submitted to the process of thought, is a unity in diversity of phenomena, the connection of diversity in form and mixtures, the culmination of all natural, sorry, I should have put this on a bigger thing. I'll put my glasses on. Or committed it to memory. Oh, there it is. All natural things and natural forces as one living whole. That one living whole becomes very important to me too, and I think that is something, again, that putting his work within the context of Romanticism helps us to better understand. And I think it's also a challenge, because we like to atomize things. I think I may be stepping on scientists' toes here, but it seems that to be the specialist in the room means to atomize often, and that's the last thing that Humboldt is going to be doing. So there's a sense in which that's an open question, but I think part of what the freedom of nature means for Humboldt, it's a collection of life forces. And he does, quoting Carl Gustav Karra, say, nature is that which is conceived as eternally growing, eternally developing, and unfolding. And again, this gets us close to this idea of nature as the realm of freedom. And again, to that question of how is a scientist supposed to present this and grasp it. And I like that he's bringing in, and in the book I have a chapter, a large chunk of the chapter on the relation between Humboldt and Carl Gustav Karra, who was both a landscape painter, as you can see that he did that, and he was also a medical doctor. So he's an interesting person who actually was combining both the scientific and the aesthetic. And Bob Richards, who was one of the first people to talk about Humboldt in his book on romantic conception of life within philosophy, is now working a lot on Carl Gustav Karra, so something really interesting will be coming out soon, I'm sure. So what I'm pushing for in the book is situating Humboldt between Romanticism and critical theory. It's not such a big push because, at least in my understanding of critical theory, they're kind of the heirs of Romanticism. And you've got Friedrich Schlegel, who I consider to be the leading philosopher of early German Romanticism. He really is pushing beyond the Eurocentric gaze, something he shares with Humboldt. and calling for the fusion of philosophy, poetry, and science. And again, many people didn't consider him, Schlegel, a philosopher, right? Because he's getting rid of hierarchies. And that's something he shares with Humboldt as well. They're overcoming hierarchies. In another paper where I'm trying to make the case for Humboldt as a romantic critic of nature, I bring in more contemporary philosophers like Malcolm Budd on the aesthetic appreciation of nature, who raises this really interesting question of how much you need to know about the things you're observing before you can really fully aesthetically appreciate them. I find that just as a pure philosophical problem really interesting. Of course you get more if you know what kind of trees you're looking at, but how much is too much? Because maybe knowing too much about what you're looking at makes it impossible for you to step back and enjoy it, but not knowing anything doesn't work either. And I think that fine balance is important today too, because I think if the general public knew a little more about nature, they would appreciate it a little more deeply, and maybe not be so averse to claims about global warming and things. So knowledge is very important to aesthetic experience as well. But where those lines are, I don't need to answer those questions in the book, but the fact that working on Humboldt brings those questions to me. What I do in the book is show that someone like Malcolm Budd, in this very, very important and good work on the aesthetic appreciation of nature, is not appealing to Humboldt at all, the absence there. So I go through some contemporary discussions and try to show, well, this person's talking just about what Humboldt was doing. Why isn't he or she invoking Humboldt in the discussion? So clearing space for Humboldt to come into some of those discussions. But this I found really interesting. So Schlegel has all of these conceptual moves in place that map kind of nicely onto what Humboldt is doing. Then Walter Benjamin, who actually wrote his dissertation on the Romantics, and also in the foreword to one version of Goethe's Elective Affinities, talks a lot about the passage in that work, which is quoting, which is talking exactly about one of the characters wishing she could hear Humboldt read. So the novel is related to Humboldt, and then Benjamin is picking up on that as well. So Humboldt is present in this very interesting interplay of ideas. And then Adorno, he has a longer life than poor Walter Benjamin's life was cut short because of, so did Adorno. They both had to escape from Germany, but poor Walter Benjamin didn't make it, and he committed suicide rather than be caught by the Nazis. He has very, very interesting, good work. Also, I'm not going to say Benjamin is just like Humboldt, but they're both, Benjamin, Adorno, and Humboldt, that's what they share, the critical theorists with Humboldt, I say. They're very interested in making sure their work is taken up by the public. They want to transform the public in some way. And you see that in Humboldt's work explicitly, where he says that one of his main objectives is to transform the German public. Yes, especially the young people, but not just the young people, and to awaken a pure love of nature in them. So this is on his mind. So part of what I have to do when I'm going through his work and think about what is he doing to awaken this love for nature. It's a hard goal to set, right, for any writer, because how can you have that kind of control over your public? But he has it there, and he wants to make sure this unfamiliar landscape that had been so unfairly treated by people like Hegel is going to be taken up by the young people in a just way. And we'll come to some of his language of justice in just a minute. But Adorno, in aesthetic theory, so Adorno gets out of Germany, he's in the US. That's where he has that famous grumpy claim about the US, that the only reason in English there's an expression like he's a real character is because there's so little character in the US. But anyway, this book is really important, kind of impenetrable in many ways, but he does mention Humboldt And in critiquing Hegel, which I particularly like, in case you may not have noticed already, Hegel's not my favorite philosopher for many reasons. But he mentions Alexander von Humboldt, and interestingly enough, the translator of the work into English in a footnote says he's talking about Wilhelm von Humboldt, which is clearly not the case. So again, that's another way Alexander disappears, right, under the shadows of his brother. But Romantic philosophy is a kind of borderline philosophy. It's a move away from hierarchies. So here I mentioned that already. Schlegel claims in Critical and again, he's writing in fragments. That's a big no-no for philosophers, right? We're supposed to be systematic thinkers, so can't be a serious philosopher if you're writing in fragments. But he is. He is a serious philosopher, and he is writing in fragments. Art should become science, and science art. He praises Goethe's Wilhelm Meister because in it, art becomes a science and life and art. And then Goethe, in a poem, asks whether scientific results could perhaps be presented in a poem. And this is, I have a screenshot with Goethe there, of course. But Goethe does figure prominently in my tale, at least, of Humboldt, because I happen to think that that Humboldt was the scientist that Goethe wished he had become. He couldn't. He had a lot of duties in the Duchess of in overseeing the university in Weimar and all of his other work. But if you look at some of the correspondence, it becomes clear that he deeply, of course, admires Humboldt. And I think there's a little bit of envy. Nothing like than what you see, since we had that slide of Schiller and Humboldt and Goethe. Schiller was very envious of Humboldt because Goethe favored Humboldt, I think, a little bit over Schiller. So the correspondence gets very interesting in that way. It makes me lose a little bit of respect for Schiller. You know, envy is not a very nice trait to have. This is just a nice poem about Natur und Kunst from Goethe. Nature and art, it's a clumsy translation, but nature and art appear to flee from one another, but find each other in the blink of an eye. The tension has disappeared for me, and both seem to attract me. So Goethe is this thinker also who's joining art and science. Again, it seems to be part of a very special moment in an intellectual history in the German-speaking world there, that Humboldt is part of. And here I'm kind of jumping. Humboldt talks a lot of raw empirie, which he wants to avoid. And then you have this really interesting, what I call a romantic manifesto, the earliest program for a system of German idealism. Romantic manifesto is easier to say and gets to the heart of the matter more, where the authors, it was found in the handwriting of Hegel, but people think it could have been written by Hölderlin, Schelling, or Hegel. And it's this kind of call to make science, again, more aesthetic. And you need aesthetic sense in order to do anything, especially to do science. So if you just limit yourself to what is quantifiable or measurable, you're going to remain in the dark, in the darkness of this empiricism. And what this short text leads us to think about is that if nature were a collection of mechanistic laws, a pile of lifeless objects, then we could understand it with only measurements and measuring instruments. But clearly, Humboldt, with all of his talk of the life of nature and the realm of freedom, doesn't see nature as that. So instruments are going to help us, but only to a certain extent. And this is really, I think, helpful. It's been helpful to me as a kind of frame for understanding Humboldt, that it's this balancing, as I mentioned before, of mastery and freedom. The aesthetic is kind of part of the move away from mastery and dominance. So in Humboldt's writings on nature, the realm of nature's beauty and delight brings us to the realm of aesthetic experience and a freedom that is not exhausted by human agency or human willing. I think that's really important too, because there's a modesty in the aesthetic turn that Humboldt's taking. He is very careful, as we've seen in that tableau image. He is going to measure everything, and he has all the skills to do that, but he's humble enough to know that he can't get the last word on that. And then where he jumps off is into the aesthetic, where the delight and beauty and the sublimity of nature can step in. And so to understand nature, and this is kind of a point from Adorno too, you have to step out of mastery and dominance. And I think I wrote a paper, a chapter focusing on Humboldt for a post-humanism volume, and that was a point I came to in preparing that paper, that we have to see that the human, and a lot of what Laura was talking about, I think, in this mess we've made of the earth has to do with this idea that we think everything's under our control and under our mastery. And if you would step out of that and see that it's not, there would be a step in back to the aesthetic, and I think a greater sense of care and appreciation for the earth. And I think Humboldt saw that many years ago, and we have yet to see it properly. So empirical methods are not sufficient to grasp the spirit of nature. And that's there too. A lot of times people, after listening to me speak on Humboldt, want to know what his view of God is. And then I have to step in and say, well, the spirit of nature for him, there's, in fact, one of the early reviews of Cosmos in English gave a very strong critique, not in the sense of romantic critic of nature, but just negative thing to say about someone, that there was no word God in the whole book. So where was God? There is not that sense of a spirit there. He says the most important result of sensible physical research into nature is to grasp the spirit of nature which lies beneath the blanket of appearances. In this way, we go beyond the narrow limits of the sense world, and then we may grasp nature through its raw empirical matter and also master it through ideas. Now, the word mastery comes up there, but this idea of ideas, again, we're jumping back up to freedom there. So he's always balancing these two realms, the empirical kind of data, which can be mastered, and then the ideas, which go beyond that kind of a mastery with instruments. To grasp the spirit of nature, more than empirical methods are needed, and part of whatever will count as the spirit of nature will be the deep relations that connect the seemingly isolated parts of nature into one great whole, animated. That's another big trope in his writings, the lebendiger Hauch der Natur. He talks about the living breath of nature, and he doesn't want vicious, he calls it. That's how I like that translation. I don't know that it's exactly right, rohe empirie, but it was translated by Etes, vicious empiricism. But I do think empiricism becomes vicious when you think it's the only thing that's going to get you to penetrate into the spirit of nature. And Humboldt seems quite aware that you're going to need empiricism, but it can't be the only path into the spirit of nature. And that's why history is important to him as well. If you look in a lot of the passages he writes, he's talking about getting these connections between each part to the unity of nature. And part of it is historical connections, seeing how far back we can take a given phenomenon of nature and how we can connect it back up to other things to get to that unity of nature and the spirit of nature. So the Natur, am I running out of time? I might be. I'll be, huh? Oh, okay, I'll just race through this super fast. Just quickly, the Naturgemälde, I think this is the tool of unity he's using. This is his literary form. And this is how he is able to present nature as a kind of totality, as a living, breathing whole, intimately connected to the realm of value. And I think the best way to understand the Naturgemälde is our literary performance as acts of preservation, that preserving the breath of nature. And we've got the vicious empiricism. I'm just going to skip this fast quickly because I just want to, get to this actually, because he says here, in order to depict in a lively way the intuitions and feelings awakened in us by a pure sense of nature, the language used must always be infused with the worth and freedom of nature. I think that's very important, and it's significant for a scientist who's also very concerned with empirical data to be talking about the worth and freedom of nature. So that, I'll leave you with one quick, the Avila, that's the Pico de Humboldt there. And then I will skip over Hartmut Böhme, very good on the Naturgemälde. and the aestheticism, and that we've already seen. So I will skip over the steps and get to the hermeneutical problems. He wants to enrich the intellect, enlarge the sphere of ideas, and nourish and vivify the imagination. That's always very important to him. And that literary form is a balm against the science that chills the feelings. I'm skipping. And I think, I'll end on this note, that I think to get Humboldt back into our conversations, we have to take some risks. He took risks. He took hermeneutical risks, clearly, in developing these new literary forms and fusing science and art. And I think we know the Humboldt current. He's got a current named after him, but I think a lot of the currents of his thought have been neglected, and I think that's really exciting work that we can do, including something suggested by the editors of the Views of Nature, a companion to the Views of Nature, right? So that's something more we can talk about. Thank you for your patience. I'm sorry, that was supposed to be. I know, I did that so I would be short, but that didn't work.
No, it's perfect. Absolutely. I like vicious.
Oh, you do?
So I have a question regarding kind of his view of indigenous spirituality. And of course, he had good relationships with the indigenous people who he met, especially considering his contemporaries, many of the imperialists. However, in his writing around empiricism as being the best way to get to the spirit of nature, I think one could read that as seeing indigenous spirituality, which does not have empiricism, as being of a lesser register. Does that make sense? Am I reading Humboldt correctly?
Well, it makes sense. I think I may have confused you. I didn't mean to say that empiricism is a way to get to the spirit of nature for Humboldt. In fact, he thinks that it will only take us so far, and then we need to have this aesthetic dimension as well, which I think, to your question, which is a very good one, he was more open to these I hate the term non-Western because they are the indigenous ways of thinking about the spirits there, and he wasn't dismissive of them at all. So I think he would be open to that. He was not following a sort of mainstream European religion in that way, so he would be more open to that kind of a spirituality and a native spirituality. Does that help? Thank you for your question. Oh.
Really just a quick follow-up, but at the same time, he was prepared to remove objects of spiritual importance to native peoples, take them out to Europe. So and in his writings, to me, he is at times rather dismissive of indigenous cultures. In other words, it's a very complex, multifaceted relationship, for me at least.
Yeah, I do tend to have a, I don't want to get hagiographic with Humboldt. Oh, he's just great and doesn't make any mistakes. He made those mistakes, and that's actually in the introduction to the translation of the Views of Nature. That bone comes up that he takes away from the native site. But I guess the reason I have this positive view of his view of the native cultures is simply having worked so much on Latin American philosophy and seeing so many dismissive European views. So I guess it depends where your bar is, which is not the best way to go about this. You're right. So I don't want to come across as saying, oh, Humboldt never makes a mistake based on his European background, but I think compared to, let's say, Hegel, he's much more open, and he's going there looking, and he's critiquing in the political essay on the Kingdom of New Spain. He's very critical of the missions, right? and what they're doing to the people there. So that's what I'm thinking of in terms of his view of the natives, but not at all to sugarcoat and say he didn't do anything that was bad. But I think if we did a chart, maybe he would win in terms of more good things that he's doing. And I think part of the indirect proof of that is going back to my opening remarks of well, we can go to the Carta de Jamaica of Bolivar, right? The founding father of many republics of South America, and he's saying to the person asking about his new territory, even someone like Humboldt doesn't know exactly what's to be found there. And, you know, if Humboldt, it's sort of saying if Humboldt doesn't know about this territory, nobody does. So the fact that Bolivar is appealing to Humboldt in this very laudatory way says something. Now, he's a criollo, so he's also a person who says we are Americans by birth and Europeans by right, and we have to assert these rights against the natives. So that doesn't end the story, but I think there is a lot of evidence pointing to the fact that the general view of Humboldt is someone who did respect Americans, maybe the criollos more than the indigenous, but he was trying. He was sending notes on the languages back to the Schlegel brothers, so he was interested in a much deeper way than a lot of the Europeans. That's all. Okay.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much.
We're going to do an...
So while Dan's taking care of a little housekeeping there, just to reset, we are joined by Stephen Bell and Stephen Jackson. They're on this end. You've already heard from Stephen Bell. He had a comment earlier. And Dan's going to, I think, initially start with some questions. We've gotten some questions from our YouTube audience. So we're going to start with that. And then he'll let you know, he'll guide us through. He's going to lead us up the volcano of knowledge.
So after pronouncing the rules, I will be flexible, and we will allow one question in from the internet. Because what I really want to do is I want to see my colleagues, our new colleagues, interact among themselves, and I think each of them have questions about the presentations today, and I'd like to see them help each other. I firmly believe in the common stock of scientific data and the sharing of ideas, whether in the humanities or in the natural sciences. But in that spirit, here is a question from the ethersphere, and I'm so pleased that Laura has volunteered to swing the bat and hit the ball. So do you think transdisciplinarity is in part a rebirth of Humboldt? Oh, wow. Transdisciplinarity concerns that which is once between the disciplines, across the different disciplines, and beyond each individual discipline. Its goal is the understanding. Yeah. Go ahead.
I think probably all of us could speak to that, but I'll take the first swing. So when I started out, I was in English because I had flirted with becoming a scientist, and that didn't seem like the right home. So I thought, well, one thing all disciplines have in common, because I couldn't decide, was everybody writes. And so I can like go where they study language, and I'll figure it out as I go along. And so that's more or less what happened. But if you think about the old, for a long while, everybody was talking about interdisciplinarity. And there's a kind of like there's a discipline and another one, and somehow there's like some kind of relationship between them, but we have to tease out and maybe sort of stick them together or put an and, like this and that. And then somewhere in there, that stopped feeling liberating and started feeling kind of unwieldy and not very productive. And Humboldt had a big role to play in my thinking on that, because I kept finding out, one more field in which he was active. And so you'd do interdisciplinarity, and it would be like, anthropology and geology and geography and physics and biology and it would just go on forever. And then at some point you have to break through and think, wait a minute, maybe transdisciplinarity is a better way to think about this, because it's, you know, the power of disciplines is important, but when they don't come together, it's damaging. And so Humboldt is both very fruitful across all these disciplines, but he's also able to sort of move beyond the packaging, the kind of little compartmentalizing thing that we then drill ourselves into, and start thinking about movements across disciplines, and sort of, again, we were talking about the assemblages, right? Or what happens when you start thinking in terms of, and I've got a question about holes, but I'll hold off on that for a moment. But moving into thinking about currents and movements and fluidities and kind of reciprocal energies across all kinds of disciplines. And now you're thinking in terms of transdisciplinary, but it's tough to do. It's good to have a model to show yourself that it actually can be done. And again, you know, hearing about all the histories of Humboldts, right? The many Humboldts, done in a variety of different ways, depending on sort of what your questions are and what your interests need to be toward, like right now, yes, it's Anthropocene, it's climate change, and so that's going to create a certain flavor of interdisciplinarity around the question of the Anthropocene.
Yeah,
So,
thank you.
yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'll just add quickly, because, well, I had that, I just mentioned it in my talk. I think one thing he really teaches us that we would do well to continue to heed is that break from hierarchies, thinking that one is better than the other. So even the way we talk of hard and soft sciences, there's such a value-laden descriptions, clearly putting one below the other. And I think part of what Laura just nicely described with all these different areas, whenever you start, it's like going down this beautiful rabbit hole, right? And there's one more thing you have to learn about geognosy. I had to learn the meanings of some of these new sciences. But I think what's beautiful about what Humboldt is doing is he's getting rid of those hierarchies. And he's not saying that this is the one that will lead you to truth, and then these are subservient to the master discipline. So whatever we want to call it, but I think transdisciplinarity is good in the sense that it's a horizon of approaches to truth, and he's not favoring one or the other. It makes it a challenge for those of us working on him, because you don't really have a home to place the work you're writing about it. Maybe just Humboldt studies, but that's another separate problem. Does anyone else want to?
Yeah, Dr. Bell.
Well, very briefly, this sort of inspires me to think of Humboldt's art in a way. Later in his life. I'd like to play with the idea if Humboldt came back. In the formal academy, I was another discipline I can think of.
Yeah, or two, wow. But, Nicholas.
Yeah, perhaps let me then not have to shout so much. I agree with all this, and perhaps could add one particular further observation to it, and that is there are quite a few phenomena one wants to study. One can study that by nature cannot be broken down into particular disciplines and subjects, and certainly Humboldt's subject matter was interdisciplinary.
And what has happened, we already have said this now, but let me put that into other words. What has happened since is a departmentalization of knowledge. And I find myself, as an historian of science, who often deals with interdisciplinarity as topics, you know, such as now, the theory of evolution doesn't belong to any particular discipline. It's interdisciplinary by definition. And then when you try and organize a conference around it, like I'm doing now, the big difficulty is not the intellectual side of it, but the interdepartmental nature of it. It is the institutional separation that makes it difficult to get people, to get a junior and senior. Senior, you know, let them come to me. The chemists to the physicists, or the cosmologists, you know what I mean. And the biologists are very sensitive not to be dominated by the hard sciences. And the geographers, oh, you know, also, and so on. So these things are departmental issues. I find also between colleagues in our universities, the biggest barriers are not the knowledge issues and approaches, but the simple departmental things. To go from one into the other for a talk. And so, as we just said, as was just said, that of course in Humboldt's day was far less. That developed just largely through the second half of the 19th century, and very much 20th, and boy, we have it now. So, just an added observation.
I'll add one last point, unless somebody else wants to add yet another last point, and that is the nature of the problems we face are, of course, transdisciplinary, and in that sense that the problems themselves, and climate change is certainly, you know, a rather spectacular example of this, that there is no discipline that's adequate to the demands posed by climate change. No single discipline, and indeed no even, I mean, you can't say it's all the sciences alone. No, I mean, it's all, everybody needs to be on board and bring whatever they have to the table to try to work through where we are. And in that sense, you know, thinking about how to organize a university around departmental siloing when you have problems that we need to be working on together that cannot be responded to adequately around that kind of siloing. I mean, how do you create collaborative, cooperative structures without these little, you know, turf wars and jealousies? I mean, I've seen it at pretty much everywhere I've ever worked that was larger than a college level, where even there were some issues that you had to work with, but when you get to the big universities, it really does pose an institutional challenge.
Little wars are big wars. Could we turn to the three talks that we had today? Three compelling talks, three talks that lots of notes were taken by a lot of us, including you all. And Stephen, Jackson, or Bell, you want to lead with a question? Yeah, a little bit of discussion about the talks.
Nicholas's talk, which brought back memories of reading his book back
that hit me though in listening to an interesting parallel between science and biography. Insofar as in a biography, you are trying to, if you have, most people who are worth biographies are complex, multifaceted individuals. Of, the other types of people we might be interested in, a lot of different things involved in their lifetimes. A lot of different kinds of settings. So to distill that into a biography that anybody's, I've got shelf gorillas, library of biographies that I have not completely because they're
definitive.
definitive. Yeah, no, and there is one in particular of major figure in politics and art. Because it's got everything. So, and we have the same challenge. It's actually a well-recognized one in the sciences, in that the world is big, complex, and it's really diverse. Our viewing audience is having trouble hearing. Oh, okay. Sorry, I was figuring my voice was carrying okay
that's
through
why.
the room, but yeah. So I'll get closer for the audience out there on the web. So yeah. So we're so to distill it down, Einstein once said that data are theory laden. And that basically we have to have some kind of conceptual framework, some kind of idea in mind in order to know what it is to observe and to measure. I mean, we could spend from here to eternity writing down facts and observations about this room. And actually Darwin recognized the same thing in a letter. He made the comment that without an hypothesis or a theory to guide you, you might as well go to the gravel pit and carefully measure the size and shape and color of each pebble and enumerate them. And so that you really need some kind of you need a question or you need a framework to guide you to observe relevant things and to filter out all of that irrelevant stuff. And so I think there's a very direct parallel in that in the sciences, we do that filtering all the time. And in fact, our theories and concepts usually tell us what to look for. And we often don't find things unless we know that they might be there to look for. And going back to Einstein, without his theory, who would have bothered to make the exacting measurements to find out whether light rays bend? We all know light travels in straight parallel lines. And so, and the measurements to determine whether light rays passing near a large gravitational object bend required excruciating measurements that were timed precisely around a solar eclipse in the 1920s, which, so just that's one example among many. There are things that we will never see unless fundamental observations that we will never make unless we have a reason to go out and try to make those observations or make those measurements. So again, I think that going back to Nicholas's point, there are many things yet to be discovered about Humboldt, and I think a lot of them are emerging just as we speak.
that we're just now in the context of our time and the kinds of things that we're worried about, and where the kinds of questions and concerns and opportunities that are arising in our culture and society that are leading us to look at Humboldt and many other people in fundamentally new ways. So.
Science and biography, Nicholas.
Can I extend that question a little bit? First, fully agreeing with the premises here, and especially the application to the sciences. Boy, I could give examples of that. But may I extend your question in relation to Humboldt there by saying, and by addressing the ladies here, may our current turn in Humboldt scholarship that is so much more related to biodiversity, climate change and preservation be related also to the fact that women are now highly, also numerically more represented in Humboldt scholarship. In the best recent biographies are written by women. And the way women approach topics are sometimes indeed different from the way men traditionally did. Take, for example, the change in primatology that was brought about by a number of remarkable women approaching gorillas, chimpanzees, and orangs wholly differently, not confronting, not capturing, not focusing primarily on the big males, but joining, communicating, interacting, being part of. That relational, that also then emphasizes the aesthetic and the sensibilities that we have been talking about. So is that a pertinent question or impertinent?
Well, I have to. The ladies will now speak. No, she said that. I'm just, it was too juicy to let go. No, I have to say, one of the first, when I first started graduate school and thinking of myself as a future academic of whatever stripe, I was heavily influenced by feminist philosophy of science, and I remember reading Donna Haraway's essay on situated knowledges. And of course, interestingly, you brought up primatology because that was some of her early work, and looking at women in what they were doing and how they were seeing chimpanzees and gorillas and baboons, in a completely new, what was then a completely new and fresh way, asking kinds of questions that hadn't been asked before. And so coming out of that, reading her essay on situated knowledge and thinking, I don't know, it allowed me to not have to replicate what the books that I was reading, which were the earlier books written by the people that I had admired and grown up thinking I had to be like that, and thinking I can now try to move into this more Haraway perspective, and what would it look like to do that, and what kinds of questions I could develop. So I just remember that particular essay as a kind of opening shaft of light that gave me a sense of what I might be able to bring as a emerging graduate student. So thank you. It's kind of nice to know that there might have been something here out the other end that worked.
Elizabeth asked for risk-taking, so I think, Nick, go ahead.
Oh, am I supposed to take a risk now?
No. I was thinking of Nicholas's.
Well, yeah, I don't think that comment is impertinent. I would just hesitate to equate the aesthetic with the feminine, because I guess that comes out of bad experience. I was at a big meeting on Latin American philosophy and that happens too often in philosophy. It's changing, thankfully, but where it was a big meeting and there were just 3 women, right? And so whenever I mentioned aesthetics, one person would always, after that point to me and say the aesthetic is that though I embody, which is kind of a compliment, but that's not exactly what I would. I see your point though as more than just that, and clearly I think that having more women in academic positions, more women funded with Humboldt fellowships, does diversify the field. And maybe, of course, the fact that I'm a woman, and at the beginning of my career, I still have a sort of a post-traumatic stress from a FICTA meeting where in Jena, where it was like penguins coming out, just men in these dark suits, and I was just this little, graduate student, and but so you do maybe think about hierarchy more, right, and power imbalances more because you have felt them more. So there is that point there, and maybe that is transforming the field. So thank you for that comment. I hope it is.
Another comment I'd make on top of that is that we have as a society and in the academic setting and in other institutional settings, there's been a lot of change, which I like to think of as progress, even though progress is a value-laden term. But we have this is a much more diverse enterprise in the sciences and in academia than it was 20 years ago or 40 years ago. And it's no secret that there is pushback against that diversification, or at least poo-pooing it as, oh, that's just, it's political correctness or whatever. And I think there's a very strong case to be made that we're hearing here, that this is not just, it's not merely about fairness and equity, which are very important, but it's also about the good of the overall knowledge enterprise, that diversification makes for better science, it makes for better scholarship, because we have these different kinds of perspectives coming in. And Nicholas's allusion to primatology is a particularly important one, because that's a field that got totally transformed. And again, it's this theory-ladenness of observation that Sarah Bleffer Hardy, for instance, went out and observed baboons and saw stuff that the female baboons were doing that generations of male primatologists had not seen. They had seen it, but they had not just thought about it, or it hadn't seemed significant, and it really turned over a lot of the thinking about what's really going on in baboon societies. It's not just what the males are doing and what they're dictating, but that the female baboons had a very big role to play, and that much of the behavior and troop structure was being driven by the females in the troops. And again, that's one example among many that happened in primatology and in any number of other fields in the 60s and 70s that I think made a lot of people realize that, that in hindsight we can see how much the science was missing by being male and white and largely Euro and European and American. And I think the more diverse the perspectives, whether it's ethnically, gender, or socioeconomic, or even political, Marxist critiques of sociobiology really drilled right into the heart of some of the weakest parts of that were identified by people who were very explicitly ideological. And whatever their motivations, they were still, they definitely got some good insights into that. So I think there's a very strong case to be made that the more diverse our collective enterprise, the more rapidly and effectively truth and knowledge will advance.
There's so much that I could say about these three papers, and time doesn't allow. I don't want to suggest that what I am going to talk about is necessarily more important than anything else. I would like to, debate for an hour the cosmos. It came up in all three presentations, and it's, for me, a publishing project that's freighted with all sorts of issues. But there are two things I did want to talk about a bit. One is Nicholas's, what I call the use and abuse of the Humboldt brothers, in short. What's going on in Germany right now in Berlin? You have the building of this Humboldt Forum, the most central, significant cultural space of a certain sort that there will be in Germany's capital. It will formally link the Humboldt University with the great museum institutions on Museum Island. So the beat goes on in terms of Humboldt scholarship. It is uneven, it is international in a certain sense, and it's also full of national and linguistic components. The last Humboldt meeting I was at was in Paraguay this summer. There was nobody from the Anglophone world there apart from me, and I'm only there because I happen to know something about Bonpland, who was imprisoned famously for around about 10 years in Paraguay. So this business of historiography, we recycle, Nicholas said, a great deal in Humboldt research. I think that is true of the past, it's true of the present. It's also true of research on Bonpland. But does it need to be that way? No, because one comes across original work all the time. And how do you foster more original work? For me, the most important single thing that helps with that is internationalization. Humboldt was an extraordinarily international individual. I often think about what was it like traveling with Bonpland, doing field research years on end, where you're German-speaking as a native, you've picked up French, you've both got Spanish. Bonpland doesn't have any or very little German. Humboldt has English. Bonpland has precious little of that. So French becomes the actual language, or maybe Spanish some of the time, that they're sharing on their daily basis. And then both of them fascinated by indigenous cultures and doing their best to comprehend those. There's some sort of, I don't know, it's going to sound like UNESCO in a minute, you know. There's something here that's, to me, tremendously stimulating about the possibilities that come through the learning of languages. I'm sort of delighted to work in a university that still has significant language departments that focus on cultural history and not literature in just a traditional sense, and where you can sort of make some sorts of links with Spanish and Portuguese and so forth. So I'm getting long-winded here, but the internationalization of Humboldt and Bonpland scholarship is what I would like to see more and more of. And the reality is, this international colloquium of Humboldt-Bonpland studies, it's not German-based, it's actually sort of French-based, but it's actually headed up by somebody of German background who's worked in a Spanish university in Alicante, Irene Prufer, Spain, and she deserves a lot of support in trying to keep building forward in this. Yep.
Very nice.
I'd just like to follow that up with, by tossing a question towards Nicholas, and that is, Stephen just commented on how there's all of this Humboldt activity going on in Germany, a major resurgence, big investment, and many different diverse activities. Would that be happening today if, the question is, how much of that is deriving from the reunification? Is this something that we would be seeing if we still had two Germanys?
Just very quickly. Yeah, I mean, this is about the repositioning of Berlin in the world, it seems to me. I don't know the city well. I went to the Humboldt Commission in 2000 to give a talk. I suppose I came away a little bit like Alexander von Humboldt. I spent time in France, and Berlin didn't do it for me quite the way that Paris did. I was there in Berlin last summer, and I was bowled over by the sheer scale of investment in the capital's back in Berlin, and it's very much being developed as a capital with vast amounts of money being poured into culture in that city. And yes, I mean, it's not without all sorts of layers of ambition, this Humboldt Forum. It seems to me that it reconnects with German Romanticism. It reconnects with the 19th century, and it elides to a certain extent the complication of the 20th century that all Germans carry as a burden.
Yeah, Elizabeth, have a comment there.
Oh, well, yeah, just before then, yeah, in light of what Stephen was talking about and bringing up Irene's work, I think that's absolutely right. And if I think about actually the connections here, Laura and I wouldn't have met if not for Berlin and that meeting. And there's I'm torn on that. Irene's meetings are always very good. And I was actually supposed to go to Paraguay, but it was so complicated to get there. Anyway, that's not relevant right now. But there's another meeting this next summer in León in Spain. Those meetings are peculiar, though, and I think you've been at quite a few of them. This is a very productive meeting, and most of those are productive too, but part of it is, again, ambition here in a strange way of who gets to organize it and who gets to decide what the topics are, and how much real exchange is going on becomes a question. But I think you're absolutely right to focus on this point of internationalization and bringing people to those countries. Paraguay was very important, I thought, and bringing work on Humboldt to Latin America and having Latin American thinkers participate in the meetings that are going on in Europe, because that gets us out of those silos again, and again, out of this idea that all of the important work is being done in the US or in Europe. So I think that's even more, it's part of the diversity issue, because you need that diversity of voices too. And I found that really, really helpful, but I think I'll pass it over now to you because.
Well, just to try and answer the specific question, whether with a still divided Germany, we would have seen something similar of what's happening today, certainly not in this unification of Wilhelm and Alexander. That is very much, I think, a unified German approach, if only because the brother, gosh, he was somewhat late, claimed to the best of my knowledge in East Germany, but he's connected more to German idealism, whereas Alexander, by the communists, was connected to humanism, which was rather a different thing. And of course now, since unification, I think there may be a broader combination of the two here, but the Western position, by and large, has won out because in the East, after unification, of course, there was an extreme eradicating of the academic elite. They were thrown out far more than the Nazis were after they'd lost the war. I think basically they were all cleaned out and had to reapply. I think it was that serious. And some of them used their Humboldt sympathy, knowledge, scholarship as an argument to be reinstated or to keep their jobs in the East. But then said we all along agreed with the Western interpretation. Do you see? So the Marxist side was very quickly dropped, And people disliked it when in my book I said, in my view, in terms of quality of scholarship, the Eastern, the communist scholarship on Humboldt was better than the Western. But, no, yeah, and so on. One can go on about this. But that's an attempt at an answer to your question.
I think it's an important answer. And again, Nicholas is pointing to the importance of institutions, I think. I knew people in West Germany with important roles in terms of disbursement of funds in the Central Research Agency, the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. And they would say things like to me, well, all these proposals in the East are relatively weak, but we have a political mission to address the funding needs of the former East Germany as quickly as possible and to try to bring it up in their sense onto the same level as the former West Germany. So this is something that has enormous consequences. It's a form of cultural imperialism in a certain sense. I don't want to offend anybody in Germany by saying that, and they may have it wrong, but you know, I'm all in favor of Humboldt scholarship wherever it's coming from. But I think that these institutional shifts after the wall came down, behavior of institutions, is something that I don't know whether these things too will have their historians, if not now, fairly shortly in due course.
Elizabeth has something brewing here.
Just add really quickly, just based on my own experience, because I do think imperialism is the right word. We were having a sort of discussion about just this matter during the break, and I found it always puzzling at the Humboldt Forschungsstelle that all of the workers were from the former East, and very welcoming and helpful in every way, and der chef was not. Right, and I found that repeated in different settings. The position of power went to someone from the West. And they were lucky to keep their jobs, actually, because in Leipzig, they cleared out the entire philosophy department of anyone who had been there in the former East. As if, I mean, it's true, it was not called philosophy, it was called, you know, Marxistische and Leninistische Wissenschaften. But some of the people there were doing important philosophical work, and the cleaning out was done rather robotically. It's just, you were there under the East, you must be bad, we'll give your jobs to the people from the West. And they took them, no questions asked, without thinking about the displacements. And that is unsettling, and I think this forum is a great idea, but I think we have to look at it carefully in terms of at what cost you get this going and who is displaced by this. Now, time goes on and we forget about all of those things that took place, but certainly not that I can speak for Humboldt, but I don't think he would be happy about the sort of thing that would have gone on in his own Forschungsstelle there and the sort of power structures that took over.
So it's 5 o'clock, and thank you very much for allowing us to experiment on you. So now it's time. Yes, Stephanie, very good. Could we introduce ourselves? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question, and it's a big one, but I'll, again, take another swing. So I've been thinking through the afternoon about this word holism or whole, and it's something that's been on my mind from time to time, but it was when Elizabeth mentioned the phrase one living whole. And the notion of whole, and I've wrestled with this in other contexts with people who say that is a totalitarian vision, and you had a moment when you were wrestling with that word. And so there's a kind of negativity. To be whole is to be totalitarian. It is to claim mastery over the entire system. And therefore, you know, any language, it's a kind of, it's part of what many of us would say a misattribution of Humboldt as the kind of imperial I want it all. And so, you know, looking at the earth as a whole in that sense, that's kind of, I left out a part of the talk, which is the globe, the globality of the earth. When you do imagine that you can hold it in total, that somehow, that part of the talk I illustrate with a little scene from Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, where Charlie, you know, the character is bouncing this globe around and doing a dance with it in sort of a mock Hitler. And that sense that we can, in fact, master and control the whole in that totalitarian sense. Well, okay, so then you've got the kind of Humboldtian language that I wrestled with this when I talked in my first book about rational holism and empirical holism. I was using empirical holism as a way to talk about Humboldt. And I was troubled at the time, and I've remained troubled since. And it's actually about the use of the word holism, because there's a figure there. It's both an embodied thing and a figure of speech. And I haven't yet found a word in English that would figure it in the way I think that Humboldt figures it, which is perhaps the kind of living whole becomes an aesthetic. Kind of, again, thinking about, is the definitive whole Humboldt ever going to be in a definitive biography? No. I mean, Nicholas has convinced us all of that. So what you have, and it was interesting, he kept insisting, it's not that these whole Humboldts that we have in all these different treatments are somehow flawed or wrong or biased or, you know, all of these ways of sort of degrading. But I would say they're integrated, poetic, and I think this is what I'm driving at. When Humboldt speaks of my notion of the planetary theorist, there's a kind of claim here about the kind of whole that he would acknowledge as the kind of gift to us of being on a planet, which is not that we can control it like a globe, sort of flatten everything and own it, but the kind of reciprocal energies are always beyond us. There will always be more, and always different questions. The point about, you know, asking the question that nobody thought to ask before, that will suddenly reveal something that we never knew we didn't know, right? The unknown knowns. That the poetic whole is an integrated whole. It's very satisfying, these different books. And Nicholas's own book is itself a very satisfying poetic whole. And I think, you know, those of us who are writers strive for that. But to say it's definitive, or to say it's a totality, to say that somehow it's mastered, I don't feel I've ever mastered, or finished. And Cosmos itself is not an attempt at mastery. I mean, finally, I love it that we're sort of emphasizing Cosmos, because there is no sense that Humboldt has that he's got it all, right? On the contrary, everything he does, whether it's Cosmos or Ansichten are the two examples I know best, there's always repeated efforts to turn it inside out and show, but that's just one way, or that's just one piece of it, or that's just what we know right now, but we know the fraction of a fraction to what we want to know, and there's all these questions we don't know, and there's all these arguments happening from, you know, people I respect don't know the answer to this, so I don't know what to approach, but here's the 14 things they say about it, which undoes the holism, even though it still holds together. So I would say a kind of poetic aesthetic integration, but we don't have a word for that. So the word whole ends up, in some cases, figuring planetarity in a way that I want to resist. And I want to hold on to that as the way that Humboldt gives us a theory of planetarity. That's what I'm trying to point to, why it's Humboldt and not any number of other people. And there's other elements that I'm still thinking this through. Chakrabarty just had an article come out, an essay in Critical Inquiry, I don't know, about 2 months ago that I need to revisit, but he is wrestling with this exact question. So more to do, but we're still working on it, I guess, all together.
I mean, this doesn't go exactly, Stephanie, to your question, but to the themes that Laura was just addressing, which I think are important, because I think back to one meeting in Alicante that Irene organized, and Otmar Etta was there, whose work is very important for the field of Humboldt studies. But he was making a point with which, and I'm pretty easygoing, but when certain things get me very worked up, and this got me very worked up because he claimed that Humboldt had failed because he didn't finish Cosmos, and being incomplete, and this comes right out of the Romantics, right? Incompleteness is not a failure. I mean, Schlegel is claiming you can never finish. That's the nature of knowledge. You're aspiring towards the absolute. You're never reaching it. So that's another thing I take out of the Romantics too, that incompleteness or not finishing is not a failure. In fact, it's a sign of humility. I think on Humboldt's part too, he knows it's bigger than he is. So that whole is an aspiration, as you nicely put it. It's nothing we're going to reach, but it's guiding our inquiry in important ways. But to claim it's a failure, that seems to miss the point altogether. And I'm not saying Etta misses much in Humboldt, but that just doesn't work, because that is I think a misunderstanding of what Humboldt's goals are in the first place. That doesn't directly relate to the issue you were exploring, but sort of a side note.
No, that relates directly to the issue.
Okay,
What do you mean? No, that's perfect.
Well, I mean, the particular question that Stephanie was raising about the Earth from space.
If you want to persuade students to read Humboldt, I wouldn't start myself with the Cosmos. I always say where Darwin's concerned, the Origin of Species must be probably the most significant, important book of the 19th century in science, or closely there. How many people have actually read it compared with the Voyage of the Beagle? A fraction, I think. Humboldt was always, of course, very keenly aware of the importance of the visual. He had a complicated publishing project in terms of financing it. He needed to build sales, and he did very careful things with sending images to places like London to publishers to try to build a readership audience in advance. That three-dimensional cross-section through the Andes, that came up again and again this afternoon for good reason. I've known it for years from a distance, but then when you pull it out and look at it in detail, my God, is it rich in material. It has artistic elements, but the Linnaean binomials are not sprayed from a helicopter on the Andean mountainsides. They're at the elevations that Bonpland mainly, and Humboldt sometimes, gathered the plant materials, and Laura talked about it and drew out some of its dimensions, and you can't emphasize everything in a short talk. But our entire understanding of we have journals that deal with altitude and mountains, and I've forgotten the name, but the three-dimensional characteristics that verticality affects ecology dramatically in the Andes, this whole business of tierra caliente, tierra templada, which is so important in understanding the geography of South America, it was all kick-started by that diagram of Humboldt's. Holism, I can't get very far with that one yet. Maybe this is probably me. I've sometimes helped job candidates in my department by making Humboldtian-like speeches on the importance of a Humboldtian vision. And there it's never holism that I emphasize. It's Zusammenhang. It's the interrelated. Yeah. We witter on today rather inelegantly for me about something we call the nature society problematic. which really is this business about the relationship between humans and the earth that we occupy. And this one compound German noun, Zusammenhang, seems to me to offer a great deal. That again, it's a thread that's come up. We can privilege the science, the human, but ultimately we never get an entirely satisfactory answer to where science and aesthetics and nature come together. That's something that Humboldt struggled with so consistently and with considerable success, but never sort of satisfied his own ambition, it seems to me, but did an immense amount. It throws down some sort of gauntlet that the rest of us can try to follow forward on. It is inspirational, it seems to me.
Just very quickly, so I'm going to start calling it hang together-ism.
Yeah, no, and I'll just add that in my manuscript, I actually focus a lot on that word because it also is very important for Schlegel's whole view of knowledge. Zusammenhänge, yeah, it's a coherence view of knowledge. So I agree that word should be here. So yeah, hang togetherness, that's good. Coherence, right? That's good. And and it brings the whole historical connection into the discussion as well. So it's a great point.
We've got 12 more minutes of joyful. Yes, David?
Oh.
Yeah, excuse me. Yes.
I'm going to do a very quick riff on that because, I'm just going to raise a question. This has gotten me thinking. So Laura introduced this Earth system science, which is, I think everybody knows, is the primary rubric that global change science is going forward on. It's more the formal modeling component, but it does occur to me that this is the question or the issue that you raised very nicely, Elizabeth, at the end of your talk. That's got a lot of wheels spinning at several levels, but thinking about this. I worry that Earth, using just the very use of the word system, and this is where I think our word choices matter greatly here. Just simply using the word system in this context implies that it's something that's it may be complex, but it's large, it's at some level it's deterministic and perhaps even just complex billiard ball kinds of physics, when in reality it isn't. It's still got this organic portion that does its own thing. And at any rate, so I worry that without Elizabeth's comments, without being mindful of this beyond mastery property of this system or whole or whatever it is we're talking about, we can easily we can delude ourselves into thinking it's a system that we can engineer, and I think this is really relevant in the context of both climate change mitigation, but particularly geoengineering, because there's some very large scale, high risk, high consequence initiatives that are under discussion that I think may come back and surprise us if this system isn't really the kind of system that we're thinking.
So system.
This is David Liu.
Yeah, David Liu, Duke University. Systema in Aristotle is the word that he uses, among other things, for the constitutions that he collects from various Greek polis. It's translated into Latin as constitutio, constitution, which for various historic reasons doesn't have the same kind of baggage as system. It just means something that stands up and doesn't fall apart, right? And in that sense, it is coherent, and it's also related to what Gilles Deleuze calls the consistent, what stands together, consistency, constance, or consistance rather, in his notion of what makes philosophy philosophy. But what I want to suggest also is that the same Aristotle who uses this term is also the one that gave us the word that Humboldt uses throughout his Cosmos, Topan, das All, translated into German, the all. And this is a term that Aristotle uses in his physics to talk about what the early Greek philosophers were wrestling with. What is the substance, or what is the quality, what is the name of the first things? For Thales was water, and for Anaximenes it was air, and Anaximander it was what he called apeiron, the boundless. And for Xenophanes was the interaction between the sea and land, which has very strong Humboldtian echoes. And Humboldt himself was under the influence of the resurgence or the revival through Schleiermacher of pre-Socratic philosophy, okay? But in the thinkers prior to Plato, there was no notion of the all which Aristotle ascribed to them, okay? For Aristotle, it was necessary to use the word topan alongside toholon, the whole, to talk about everything that could be known and could be discovered, right? Now, the fact that Humboldt uses this term, I don't think he uses toholon. He doesn't quote that word. Maybe I'm wrong. But he does use the word topan several times in the Greek. He has it typed out in the Greek, which tells us where he's getting it from. I'm afraid does introduce a problem that he himself could not entirely solve. Or certainly, by so doing, he bequeathed to us a problematic that continues to bug us and to bug the whole enterprise of knowing. Unfortunately, he doesn't seem to have used the word to apeiron, the unbounded or unboundable. And had he done so, we would have been in a better place. I mean, that's so congenial to romantic preference for the incomplete, but at the same time suggests a kind of infinite possibility of exploration. Incidentally, Topan of Aristotle does have imperial political connotations or consequences, because he was Alexander the Great's teacher. And in fact, Alexander in his conquests was not just gathering land for taxation, he was also gathering flora and fauna and sending it back to Aristotle on a regular basis. So his conquest of the world was not just political, it was also noetic, it was scientific, it was epistemological. And this is the inheritance that we have to deal with between knowledge and power.
If I can address that, I'll try not to take too long. One of the reasons I like the choice of Cosmos by Humboldt, I mean, if he if Gaia had been available, it would have been a different discussion and a different, I mean, again, how that might have been deflected to us would be a fascinating kind of counterfactual. But the use of cosmos in the sense that, you know, there were cosmoi in Greek, as I understand it. It wasn't a kind of like God created the universe, there is the cosmos, which the God created in a monotheistic sense. But no, on the contrary, they argued about, you know, this cosmos or that cosmos, and it was a plural. It could and was pluralized. So the notion that you had cosmos as Humboldt's choice, knowing Greek as he did, which could say, you know, we have a kind of poetic. Again, I like the sort of sense of standing together, hanging together, some of the alternatives that you adduced. But it is incomplete, but it is not incomplete in a flawed or like, oh, damn, we'll never get there, but a sense of sort of both poetic grandeur of our effort to reach for some kind of connectedness, as well as the kind of daunting but also inspiring sense that there's always more, the sort of sublime sense of the more, which is why you can speak of cosmoi, right? The cosmos that we might construct at this moment as our aspiration, or that Humboldt constructed as his aspirational, might not make sense to another time in another culture, another place, but that's not a problem then. That becomes just being human or being cultured, and again, there's no all that some theoretical being could access in its totality. So I like the sense of the unbounded, and yes, I would like to get the spelling of that from you before we go. Thank you.
Cosmos was not pluralized, it was unified. That is to say, from the point of view of the history of early Greek thought, a cosmos is any configuration at any scale, okay? And that's the way that the atomists Leucippus and Democritus use it. It was Plato who, I think, probably under the, what shall we say, the political framing of the Athenian Empire, which, you know, eventually led to Alexander's empire in a kind of twisted way, that made the term a unitary term. And by the time of the Hellenistic period of the early Roman Empire, it had come to mean mostly the world governed by the empire. Yeah. Okay.
The cosmos.
And so our task is to repluralize cosmos.
Yes, thank you. I love that, and I like your earlier sense, and I'd love to read your history of this term.
Yeah, that was really, I think, a great addition to the discussion, and I like that you brought up Schleiermacher's work on Plato, because of course that connects the Romantics back up into that. But I think also what your very insightful comment made clear is what we've been talking about with Cosmos, that Humboldt is very interested in doing a thorough history of this term and using it to guide his investigations of how to present nature. So it's very steeped in all of this notion of the Zusammenhang that we're talking about. And yeah, somebody maybe we found the person to write on that, right? Because that's just the kind of work that we need more of on Humboldt, is taking those claims that he's making and taking them seriously and connecting them to these bigger issues. And I love the connection you're making between then, of course, Aristotle and the stuff that Alexander is doing on behalf of empire there. I thought you were going to also go to Aristotle, and that lands us in big trouble in Latin America too, the whole civilization barbarism thing, which Humboldt is escaping from, of course, so that's Yeah, yeah, it's helpful. It's taken up, unfortunately, by, well, that's a whole other story, Sepulveda and Las Casas and the Latin American thinkers, but thank you. That's really, really helpful.
So it's 5:30. Let's say 3 cheers for ourselves and for our guests.